It did not begin with the thunder of bombs or the clash of armies, but with the quiet rise of watchtowers and barbed wire on a hill near Weimar, Germany. Buchenwald was built not simply as a prison, but as a machine of terror designed to strip men, women, and even children of dignity, identity, and life itself. Here, thousands of prisoners from across Europe, Jews, political opponents, Romani people, Soviet POWs, and countless others, were thrown into a world where survival meant enduring brutality, hunger, and despair every single day. As one of the largest concentration camps on German soil, Buchenwald became a testing ground for Nazi cruelty and a model of organized inhumanity. Behind its gates lay workshops that fed the German war machine, barracks that suffocated thousands in disease and starvation, and gallows that stood as grim warnings to anyone who dared resist. Yet within this landscape of fear, there were also whispers of defiance, acts of solidarity, networks of resistance, and the flicker of human spirit refusing to be extinguished. This documentary takes you on a journey deep into the heart of Buchenwald, from its creation in 1937 to its expansion during the war years, from the daily lives of prisoners to the hidden acts of courage that took place in the shadows. You will hear of the infamous SS commandants who ruled with terror, of the forced labor that crushed bodies while fueling the Reich, and of the international prisoners who turned this camp into a tragic crossroads of Europe. And then you will follow the story into its final, desperate days. The death marches, the collapse of Nazi authority, and the shocking liberation by American forces in April 1945, when the world first saw the full scale of horror behind the fences. But Buchenwald's story does not end with liberation. It continues in memory, in trials, in monuments, and in the voices of survivors who carried the burden of remembrance into the modern age. This is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of what humanity is capable of, both in its darkest depths and in its most resilient defiance. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always incredible to see this community coming together across time zones and countries, keeping history alive and remembering the past so that it is never repeated. Now, let us step back into history and uncover the entire history of Buchenwald. In the summer of 1937, as Nazi Germany solidified its grip over the nation, a new concentration camp was conceived in the wooded hills above the cultural city of Weimar. The camp would be called Buchenwald, a name meaning beech forest, deceptively tranquil in sound yet destined to become synonymous with terror. The site was chosen deliberately, situated on the Ettersberg Hill, a location steeped in German cultural history, where the great poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe had once walked and written beneath the trees. For the Nazis, this juxtaposition was not accidental. They sought to cloak brutality beneath a veneer of national pride and cultural symbolism. By constructing a camp so close to Weimar, the so-called heart of German classicism, the regime demonstrated that Nazi ideology would dominate even the nation's most revered cultural landscapes. The transformation of this forest into a place of barbed wire and watchtowers symbolized the perversion of Germany's soul under Hitler's rule. The camp was envisioned as both a prison and a tool of propaganda, designed to intimidate opponents and demonstrate the regime's power. In 1937, Germany was preparing for war, but it was also preparing its system of oppression. Buchenwald would soon become a central pillar in that system. The official rationale for Buchenwald's creation was the need to replace smaller, earlier camps that had been scattered across Germany. Camps like Lichtenberg and Bad Sulza had been criticized by the SS for inefficiency, lack of scale, and insufficient control. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, demanded a new model, a camp that would be both centralized and expandable, capable of holding thousands of prisoners under strict discipline. The wooded slopes of the Ettersberg provided the perfect site, isolated enough for secrecy, yet accessible by rail and road. Its location also carried symbolic weight, allowing the regime to transform a place once associated with German enlightenment into a fortress of darkness. The design reflected SS priorities: visibility, intimidation, and efficiency of control. Watchtowers would encircle the perimeter, and barracks would be arranged in military precision. From its inception, Buchenwald was not intended as a temporary holding site, but as a permanent instrument of terror. Its very construction spoke to the Nazi vision of total dominance over society. The camp was to be both a prison and a statement, a visible demonstration of the new Germany's cruelty. From the moment plans were drawn, Buchenwald's creation was tied to ideology as much as practicality. The camp would serve to isolate and punish those considered enemies of the state: political opponents, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and later Jews. It was designed not just to contain bodies, but to break spirits, reinforcing the message that opposition to Nazi rule was futile. The regime framed the camp system as a means of re-education, but its true purpose was annihilation of dignity. The SS sought to crush individuality, to replace human beings with numbers and labor units. Buchenwald, located in the shadow of Goethe's Weimar, became the perfect theater for this perversion, the birthplace of German cultural humanism, now overlooked a camp built on inhumanity. This contrast was not hidden, but celebrated by the Nazis, who relished the irony of their domination over tradition. By linking their brutality to revered landscapes, they claimed continuity with the past while destroying its essence. The birth of Buchenwald was thus an act of cultural desecration as well as political repression. The camp was built not only in stone and wire, but in the twisted logic of Nazi symbolism. Construction began in July 1937, and from the very first day, the camp was built by the very people it would later confine. Hundreds of prisoners were transferred from smaller camps and forced to clear the forest, level the ground, and build the barracks under SS supervision. With picks, shovels, and bare hands, they carved roads and erected fences, often collapsing from exhaustion. Those who faltered were beaten mercilessly, sometimes killed outright as warnings to others. The so-called Blood Road, a stretch leading into the camp, earned its name from the suffering endured by prisoners as they dragged heavy stones up the hill. The SS reveled in this spectacle, enforcing labor as both punishment and demonstration of control. Prisoners built not only their own cages, but also the infrastructure of their tormentors. From the beginning, Buchenwald was marked by suffering that became embedded in its foundations. The camp was not a place that simply appeared, it was forged through blood and pain. Every stone laid carried with it the weight of lives broken during its construction. The early vision for Buchenwald included facilities that foreshadowed the full scope of its brutality. The SS designed areas for executions, for punishment, and for medical experiments even before the camp was complete. Special cells known as the bunker were reserved for torture and isolation, where prisoners were subjected to unimaginable abuse. An execution site known as the Genickschuhsanlage or neck shot facility was constructed to allow mass killings under the guise of medical examinations. The camp also included kennels for SS dogs, who were trained to attack prisoners at command. This infrastructure reflected a system that was not improvisational but calculated, built for terror with chilling foresight. Buchenwald was not created to rehabilitate but to destroy. From its birth it was a laboratory of oppression, where cruelty was designed as policy, not accident. The Nazis sought to institutionalize brutality as an everyday function of camp life. Buchenwald was born not as a prison but as an instrument of terror. Its blueprint was cruelty, codified in architecture. Equally important to the Nazis was Buchenwald's role as a symbol of domination over German society. Its proximity to Weimar was no coincidence. The camp stood only 5 miles from the city centre, visible from certain vantage points. Citizens of Weimar could not claim ignorance, for the movement of prisoners, the smoke of crematoria, and the presence of SS guards were daily reminders of the regime's reach. This proximity served a dual purpose. It reminded the population of their own vulnerability, and it ensured complicity through silence. For the Nazis, Buchenwald was a theatre of fear, performed not only for prisoners but for the entire region. The camp announced itself as a place where enemies vanished, where suffering was normalized, and where silence was demanded. The people of Weimar lived in the shadow of this reality, forced to reconcile their cultural pride with the horror nearby. The birth of Buchenwald thus corrupted not only the landscape, but the moral fabric of the surrounding society. The camp's existence was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. From the outset, the SS leadership at Buchenwald shaped its character with a combination of brutality and corruption. Karl Otto Koch, the camp's first commandant, set the tone with unchecked authority, enriching himself through embezzlement while unleashing terror on prisoners. His wife Ilse Koch would later become notorious for her cruelty, embodying the sadism that permeated Buchenwald from its inception. The leadership understood that fear was more effective when paired with unpredictability, and thus prisoners were subjected to arbitrary beatings, humiliations, and executions. The camp quickly gained a reputation as one of the most feared in Germany, even before the war began. Its administrators were not merely bureaucrats, but agents of ideological warfare, ensuring that every element of the camp reinforced Nazi doctrine. By 1938, Buchenwald had grown rapidly, holding thousands of prisoners from across Germany and occupied territories. Its birth had given the regime a new instrument of control that would only expand in scope and horror. The seeds of atrocity were already deeply sown. The camp was alive, a machine of suffering that would only grow stronger with time. Thus, the founding of Buchenwald in 1937 was not simply the establishment of another prison, but the creation of a model of Nazi terror. Born from ideology, sustained by brutality, and cloaked in symbolism, it represented the transformation of Germany's cultural heartland into a fortress of inhumanity. The beech forests of the Ettersberg, once celebrated in poetry and philosophy, now echoed with cries of anguish and the barking of guards. Its very existence showed how the Nazis twisted every resource, land, labor, and culture, into instruments of control. The camp was built on deception, presented as order, but in truth a factory of despair. It became a warning to all who might oppose the regime, a reminder that resistance would be crushed mercilessly. Yet within its wire, it also planted seeds of defiance, for prisoners carried with them memories, cultures, and willpower that would not be easily destroyed. The story of Buchenwald began with its birth, but that birth was already a death sentence for thousands. As dawn broke over the camp's first days, a darkness descended that would last until liberation. Buchenwald was born not as a place, but as a symbol of the Nazi state itself. The creation of Buchenwald in 1937 was not carried out by civilian workers or professional builders. It was forged by the very prisoners. It was meant to contain men transferred from early Nazi camps, such as Lichtenberg and Sachsenberg, were marched into the forests of the Ettersberg, carrying little more than tools and the weight of despair. Under the constant gaze of SS guards, they were ordered to cut down the great beech trees that gave the camp its name. Each trunk felled was another symbol of destruction, the forest stripped bare to make way for barbed wire and barracks. Prisoners hacked at roots with blunt axes, their hands blistering, their backs bent beneath loads of timber. The SS supervisors barked commands, striking men who faltered, reminding them that exhaustion was no excuse. What had once been a place of natural beauty became a wasteland of stumps and mud, a stage for cruelty. The clearing of the forest was the first act of dehumanization, a demonstration that even the land would be reshaped by suffering. The birth of Buchenwald was not just construction, it was desecration. Central to the camp's creation was the infamous blood road, a pathway carved into the hillside by forced labor. Prisoners, already weakened by starvation diets and brutal beatings, were ordered to drag massive stones uphill to pave the road. The work was relentless. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds had to be carried by hand or hauled in makeshift carts. Men collapsed in the dust, their knees buckling under impossible loads, and those who stumbled were whipped or beaten until they rose again, or died where they fell. The road earned its name because its stones were stained with the blood of countless prisoners who left their lives embedded in its surface. Survivors would later recall how every step on the blood road felt like a death sentence, a punishment designed less for utility than for cruelty. The SS deliberately used construction as a means of extermination through labor. This road, leading into the camp, became both a literal and symbolic entryway into terror. Every new prisoner marched over it, walked on the suffering of those who had built it. The blood road was the camp's first monument to despair. The camp's design was a chilling reflection of Nazi priorities. Order, visibility, and intimidation. A double perimeter fence encircled the camp, consisting of barbed wire electrified at deadly voltages, backed by tall wooden watchtowers that loomed above the grounds. Each tower was manned by SS guards armed with machine guns, their searchlights sweeping the camp day and night. The prisoner barracks were laid out in rigid rows, designed for surveillance and quick suppression of unrest. At the center stood the roll call square, a vast open area where prisoners were assembled, counted, and punished, sometimes forced to stand for hours in freezing cold or blistering heat. The camp also included administrative buildings for the SS, designed in stark contrast with the squalid huts of the inmates. The architecture reinforced the Nazi vision of domination. Prisoners were caged in cramped wooden barracks, while SS officers occupied solid stone houses and offices nearby. The design was a physical expression of ideology. One group elevated, the other dehumanized. From the first blueprint, the camp was constructed as a factory of control. Its geometry served oppression as effectively as its fences. As construction advanced, new features added to the camp revealed the regime's broader intentions. Special punishment cells, known as the bunker, were installed for solitary confinement and torture. A gallows was erected to enforce discipline through public executions, a reminder to prisoners of their constant vulnerability. Even before the camp was filled, the SS prepared spaces for killing, ensuring that terror was not just implied but institutionalized. Workshops were added where prisoners would soon be forced into labor for the German war machine, foreshadowing the camp's role in supplying industry. Barracks were deliberately overcrowded, designed to hold far more men than was humane, ensuring that disease and exhaustion would spread like wildfire. Sanitation facilities were minimal, deliberately degrading, stripping prisoners of dignity and exposing them to infection. In this way, the camp was built not only to contain prisoners, but to weaken, humiliate, and destroy them. The physical structures were inseparable from the psychological landscape of despair. Every plank nailed, every stone laid, carried the weight of cruelty. From its foundations, Buchenwald was designed to break the human spirit, The prisoners who built the camp experienced daily torment beyond the back-breaking labor. They were provided almost no tools, forced to dig with bare hands, or crude implements scavenged from the soil. Meals were meager bowls of watery soup and crusts of stale bread, insufficient to sustain men breaking their bodies with endless work. Guards delighted in sadistic punishments, ordering prisoners to move piles of stones back and forth with no purpose, mocking their suffering. The labor was deliberately irrational, designed not for efficiency, but for degradation. Prisoners who dared to rest were beaten with rifle butts or attacked by SS dogs. Some collapsed and never rose again, their bodies dragged aside while the work continued without pause. Survivors remembered the construction as a period when death was constant, both from exhaustion and from calculated brutality. Each day was a battle to endure another hour, another blow, another command. The camp was not simply being built, it was being baptized in cruelty. For the men forced to raise its walls, Buchenwald was born out of their suffering. The symbolism of Buchenwald's construction extended beyond its fences and barracks. By forcing prisoners to build their own prison, the SS created a ritual of domination, erasing hope before confinement even began. Every hammer strike and shovel of earth became a reminder of the futility of resistance. Prisoners watched the camp rise around them, knowing that their own hands had crafted the walls that would hold them captive. This inversion of labor, building one's own chains, was a psychological weapon as effective as whips or guns. The SS reveled in this cruelty, mocking prisoners with taunts about their craftsmanship. For the men, the process inflicted wounds deeper than physical scars. It stripped them of agency, forcing them to participate in the machinery of their oppression. Yet even in this cruelty, there were small sparks of defiance. Prisoners who deliberately weakened structures, who carved hidden marks into beams, who left traces of themselves in the wood and stone. The camp was a prison, but it was also a battlefield of wills. Its construction told the story of both submission and quiet resistance. By late 1937, the camp began to take its recognizable form, a sprawling compound with barracks stretching across the cleared hillside, ringed by watchtowers and electrified wire. The once quiet beech forest had been transformed into a landscape of intimidation, its natural beauty erased by human cruelty. Prisoners numbering in the thousands continued to expand the camp as more huts were added and facilities grew. The SS ensured that the pace was relentless, driving men to exhaustion to finish projects faster than possible. The blood road remained a constant symbol of the suffering endured, as every new transport of prisoners was marched over its stones into the camp. By now, Buchenwald was fully operational, receiving political prisoners, so-called asocials, and others deemed enemies of the state. Its walls contained not just bodies, but the very ideology of Nazism, codified in architecture and enforced through terror. What had started as an empty forest had become a functioning machine of oppression, and it had been built entirely on the backs of those it would later consume. The camp stood ready to fulfill its dark purpose. The building of Buchenwald was more than the construction of a physical space. It was the creation of a system of terror that would endure for years. Every element of the camp, its blood road, its watchtowers, its gallows, its bunker, embodied the philosophy of cruelty that defined the SS. The camp's design was efficient, not because it served any humanitarian purpose, but because it maximized suffering while maintaining control. Prisoners were transformed into both the builders and the victims of this system, forced to shape their own nightmare. The memory of construction never left those who survived. They remembered not only the brutality of the labor, but the knowledge that their sweat and blood were embedded in the camp itself. Buchenwald's foundations were soaked in suffering, a legacy carved into every brick and stone. The camp's creation marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Its birth was inseparable from its cruelty. The beech forests of Ettersburg had been replaced by a fortress of inhumanity, and in that transformation the terror of Buchenwald had truly begun. When Buchenwald first opened its gates in July 1937, the camp was not yet the vast universe of suffering it would later become. Its earliest inmates were drawn primarily from within Germany itself, representing those groups already targeted in the Nazi campaign for ideological purification. Political opponents, especially communists and socialists who had resisted Hitler's rise, were among the first to be shipped to the Ettersburg. They carried with them the defiance of years spent underground, their arrests symbolizing the Nazis' determination to crush dissent at its root. Alongside them came members of the Social Democratic Party, union leaders, and intellectuals whose voices had once shaped the Weimar Republic. Many of these men were seasoned activists, accustomed to persecution, but Buchenwald introduced a new scale of brutality that none had faced before. They were housed in the first hastily constructed barracks, their labor shaping the camp even as they suffered. These political prisoners became both victims and unwilling pioneers, the first to endure the rhythm of Buchenwald's cruelty. Their presence signaled that the camp was not merely a holding center, but an instrument of political terror. Buchenwald was born as a weapon against opposition. Among the earliest arrivals were Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious group singled out for their refusal to conform to Nazi ideology. They were not political agitators, nor were they accused of violence, yet their steadfast refusal to salute Hitler, join the military, or renounce their faith made them enemies of the state. For the Nazis, their spiritual conviction represented defiance as dangerous as armed rebellion. These men and women were marked by purple triangles sewn onto their uniforms, identifying them for all to see. Despite persecution, they maintained their religious practices even inside the camp, whispering prayers during roll calls and sharing scripture in secrecy. The SS despised their resilience, often subjecting them to harsher punishments, but many guards also grudgingly respected their unyielding discipline. Unlike other prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses were sometimes offered release if they signed declarations renouncing their faith. Most refused. Their quiet resistance became one of the earliest examples of moral courage within the camp. For fellow prisoners, they embodied a spirit of defiance that no whip could break. Their faith became both their shield and their torment. Another group marked early in Buchenwald's history were men imprisoned under 75, Germany's law criminalizing homosexuality. The Nazi regime regarded homosexuality not only as immoral, but as a threat to the racial purity of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. These prisoners were branded with pink triangles, a mark of both stigma and persecution that made them among the most vulnerable within the camp hierarchy. Other inmates often shunned them, influenced by the prejudices of the wider society, and the SS exploited this isolation to intensify their suffering. They were frequently assigned the harshest labor details, from stone quarrying to road building, tasks deliberately chosen to weaken and humiliate them. Beatings were common, and medical experiments would later target them as subjects of supposed cures. Despite this brutalization, many displayed quiet resilience, enduring with dignity despite being despised by both their captors and sometimes their fellow prisoners. Their presence revealed how the camp functioned not only as a tool of political repression, but as a laboratory of social cleansing. In Buchenwald, hatred was systematic, coded into uniforms and triangles. Each prisoner carried a mark that dictated both fate and treatment. In addition to political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses and homosexuals, the camp also received those labeled by the Nazis as asocials. This vague category included beggars, vagrants, Roma and Sinti people, petty criminals, and anyone deemed socially undesirable. The Nazis considered them threats to the racial and moral hygiene of the nation, and Buchenwald became their cage. Many wore black triangles, their identities reduced to symbols of disdain. For some, imprisonment was the culmination of years of marginalization under Nazi rule. For others, it was the beginning of suffering they could scarcely imagine. These prisoners were often treated as expendable, used in the most dangerous tasks, and beaten mercilessly for the smallest infractions. The SS regarded them with contempt, considering them unworthy of survival. Yet within the camp, these so-called asocials formed bonds of survival, creating fragile networks of support in the face of common cruelty. Their suffering highlighted how Buchenwald targeted not only political threats, but also those who simply failed to conform. The camp was an experiment in remaking society by eradicating its outcasts. Its early population reflected the breadth of Nazi persecution. The arrival of these diverse groups in 1937 and 1938 shaped the early atmosphere of the camp. Political prisoners brought with them traditions of organization, discipline, and underground resistance, which would later play a crucial role in Buchenwald's history. Jehovah's Witnesses infused the camp with spiritual endurance, showing that faith could survive even in places of darkness. Homosexual prisoners endured compounded torment, reminding all that Nazi ideology extended into the private and intimate spheres of life. So-called asocials reflected how the regime sought not only to dominate political enemies, but to purify society by erasing difference. The mix of prisoners created a complex social order within the camp, where symbols and triangles dictated identity and status. Some groups were despised more than others, creating divisions that the SS exploited to maintain control. Yet over time, survival required cooperation, and fragile alliances began to emerge. The early prisoner community was fragmented but resilient, adapting to conditions while preserving dignity in small acts. The camp's foundations were thus laid not only in stone but in human relationships, forged under duress. Buchenwald was a society imposed by force but shaped by endurance. The SS deliberately used the early prisoners to set patterns of control and terror. They introduced the infamous roll calls, where men were forced to stand for hours, sometimes entire nights, regardless of weather, until every number matched the ledger. They established punishments such as beatings, hangings, and confinement in the bunker, ensuring that obedience was enforced through fear. Early inmates quickly learned that survival required both resilience and caution to obey without hesitation, yet to preserve humanity where possible. The political prisoners, many of them communists, began to quietly form networks, offering protection to weaker groups when they could. These initial dynamics laid the groundwork for the prisoner self-organization that would later define Buchenwald's unique history of resistance. But in 1937, resistance was faint, a flicker against the overwhelming might of the SS. The first prisoners endured in silence, shaping coping strategies that others would inherit. Their suffering became the template for thousands who would follow. The early years were a laboratory not only for Nazi brutality, but also for prisoner endurance. The camp's rhythms were established in these formative days. The SS also established the system of prisoner functionaries during this early period, appointing some inmates to positions of authority over others. Known as capus, these men were often chosen from criminal or asocial categories, selected for their willingness to enforce brutality on their peers. The system created divisions, ensuring that the camp's violence was not only top-down but internalized, turning prisoners into instruments of control. For those under their power, capus became as feared as SS guards, their whips and fists enforcing discipline within barracks and work details. This structure spread suspicion and distrust, isolating prisoners from one another and weakening solidarity. Yet political prisoners also maneuvered to place their own members in such positions, using them to protect comrades and subtly resist SS domination. The early years saw this power struggle unfold, with alliances and betrayals shaping daily survival. For new arrivals, the camp's cruelty was not confined to the guards. It came from fellow inmates forced into impossible roles. The system of capus was born in these years, and would remain a defining feature of Buchenwald's structure. It was one of the camp's cruelest inventions, survival by collaboration. By 1938, Buchenwald held thousands of inmates drawn from across German society, each group marked, segregated, and brutalized according to Nazi ideology. The camp had already evolved into a microcosm of persecution, where political dissenters, religious minorities, sexual minorities, and social outcasts lived and suffered side by side. Their presence demonstrated that Buchenwald was not initially built as part of the Holocaust against Jews alone, but as a weapon of repression against all deemed undesirable. Yet these early years laid the foundation for the camp's later role in the genocide of Europe's Jews. The mechanisms of control, the systems of labor, the hierarchies of triangles, and the rhythm of cruelty were already in place. For the prisoners themselves, survival became a matter of endurance, adaptation, and the fragile hope that liberation might one day come. They could not know in 1937 or 1938 that Buchenwald would expand into one of the largest camps in Germany, housing over 250,000 prisoners before its liberation. The early inmates carried the weight of establishing patterns that defined all who followed. Their suffering became the bedrock of Buchenwald's terror. Its story began with them. At the helm of Buchenwald's early history stood Karl Otto Koch, an SS officer whose corruption, cruelty, and ambition defined the camp's character. Appointed commandant in 1937, Koch was handpicked by Heinrich Himmler to shape Buchenwald into a model of Nazi repression. Koch embodied the SS ethos of absolute authority, wielding power without accountability. His uniform, adorned with black insignia, symbolized not only rank, but the ideology of terror that guided his every decision. For Koch, prisoners were not human beings but resources, to be exploited, humiliated, and destroyed at will. He established Buchenwald as a place where brutality was policy, where suffering was orchestrated as much as punishment. His personal greed, however, set him apart even among SS leaders. He embezzled funds meant for the camp, profiting from prisoner labor and stealing valuables from the dead. Under his leadership, Buchenwald became not only a camp of terror, but also a nest of corruption. Koch was the architect of cruelty, blending ideology with personal vice. Koch's wife, Ilse Koch, quickly earned her own infamous reputation, becoming one of the most feared figures in Buchenwald. Known to prisoners as the Witch of Buchenwald, she was notorious for her sadism and for her obsession with collecting grotesque trophies. Survivors later testified that she ordered prisoners with unusual tattoos to be killed so their skin could be preserved as macabre souvenirs, though the full extent of this practice remains debated. Whether myth or reality, the very rumor spread terror throughout the camp. Ilse rode on horseback through the prisoner compound, accompanied by SS dogs, searching for victims to humiliate. She delighted in arbitrary cruelty, ordering beatings for the smallest infractions or simply for her amusement. Her presence reinforced the message that power at Buchenwald was capricious and terrifyingly personal. She also shared her husband's greed, enriching herself through embezzlement and corruption. To prisoners, Ilse embodied the SS at its most sadistic, blending cruelty with extravagance. Her figure became a legend of horror within the camp. The SS command at Buchenwald was structured to enforce terror from the top down. Under Karl Otto Koch, officers and guards were given wide latitude to brutalize prisoners as they saw fit, creating an atmosphere of unchecked violence. Orders from Berlin emphasized strict control, but much of the day-to-day cruelty stemmed from the initiative of guards themselves. Beatings, executions, and humiliations were carried out not only as punishments, but as entertainment. Prisoners quickly learned that survival depended not only on rules, but on the whims of individual SS men. The camp was a laboratory of fear, where unpredictability itself became a weapon. Koch encouraged this culture, believing that chaos among prisoners reinforced SS dominance. The guards, many drawn from the ranks of young men indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, were eager to demonstrate loyalty through brutality. In this environment, cruelty became routine, normalized as part of daily operations. The command structure ensured that ideology translated seamlessly into terror. The ideology behind Buchenwald's command was rooted in the SS worldview, where human beings were reduced to categories of worth and unworth. Prisoners were stripped of names and assigned numbers, their identities erased to reinforce their status as subhuman. SS officers saw themselves as the guardians of the Reich's purity, tasked with eliminating enemies through imprisonment, labor, and death. For Koch and his subordinates, brutality was not merely allowed but celebrated as part of their mission. Punishment was justified as discipline, exploitation as efficiency, murder as necessity. The ideological dehumanization of prisoners allowed guards to commit atrocities without remorse. Even children were not spared, as the camp leadership regarded them as carriers of degeneracy. The SS believed that their cruelty was service to Germany, cloaked in a twisted sense of duty. Koch himself often spoke of Buchenwald as a place of education, a grotesque euphemism for terror. Ideology provided the moral cover for acts that would otherwise seem monstrous. Corruption, however, was as central to Buchenwald's command as ideology. Karl Otto Koch siphoned off money, food, and supplies intended for the camp, diverting them into his personal accounts. He collaborated with civilian businesses, profiting from prisoner labor and stealing valuables confiscated from inmates. The Koch household became infamous for its extravagance, with Ilse purchasing fine clothing and luxuries, while prisoners starved just beyond her window. Embezzlement was rampant among SS officers, who treated the camp as both a fortress of power and a source of wealth. Corruption did not weaken the cruelty, it reinforced it. Prisoners suffered more because rations and resources were stolen, and punishments were inflicted to conceal thefts or eliminate witnesses. This intertwining of ideology and greed created a system where exploitation was limitless. The SS command saw no contradiction between loyalty to Hitler and personal enrichment. At Buchenwald, corruption was not a flaw in the system, it was part of its design. Ilse Koch's role in the camp reflected the uniquely personal nature of cruelty at Buchenwald. Unlike other camps where women played peripheral roles, Ilse wielded direct influence, reinforcing her husband's authority and instilling fear among prisoners. Survivors recalled her frequent inspections of the camp, where her gaze alone could seal a man's fate. The infamous stories of lampshades made from human skin, whether myth or truth, reflected how deeply her legend spread among inmates. Prisoners spoke of her cruelty with a mixture of fear and fascination, uncertain where fact ended and terror began. Her notoriety symbolized the camp's descent into moral abyss, where the line between reality and rumor blurred into horror. Ilse Koch became a figure larger than life, embodying the sadism of the SS in a single name. To those inside the wire, She was not only a commander's wife, but a tormentor in her own right. Her presence ensured that cruelty was not confined to official orders, but infused into the very atmosphere of the camp. Buchenwald's terror was made flesh in figures like Ilse. The broader SS staff under Koch included officers and guards who carried out his policies with zeal. Men like Hermann Pister, who later succeeded Koch, and other lower-ranking SS officials, helped solidify Buchenwald's reputation as one of the harshest camps in Germany. Many of these men were careerists, seeking advancement by demonstrating ruthless efficiency. They saw cruelty as proof of loyalty and brutality as a pathway to promotion. The SS indoctrination ensured that they viewed prisoners not as fellow humans, but as enemies to be controlled, exploited, and destroyed. The staff operated under a code of impunity. Crimes committed against prisoners were rarely punished unless they threatened SS discipline. Even when corruption scandals arose, as they eventually did with Karl Otto Koch, the concern from higher authorities was not the suffering of prisoners, but the betrayal of SS standards. This hypocrisy highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the system. For prisoners, it mattered little who commanded. The cruelty remained constant. The SS as an institution ensured that ideology and terror were inseparable. Thus, from the very beginning, Buchenwald was shaped not only by ideology, but by the personal corruption and sadism of its commandants. Karl Otto Koch established a regime of brutality cloaked in authority, while Ilse Koch became a legend of terror in her own right. Together they symbolized the fusion of Nazi ideology and personal vice, where power meant the freedom to exploit, torture, and destroy. Their leadership ensured that Buchenwald was not merely a place of imprisonment, but a place of spectacle, where cruelty was performed and magnified. The SS command structure reinforced this by normalizing violence, rewarding brutality, and punishing compassion. Corruption was not an exception, but part of the system, making suffering even more acute. Under Koch, Buchenwald became a theater of inhumanity, where ideology and greed walked hand in hand. This was the face of Nazi command, ruthless, corrupt, and sadistic. The camp's future horrors were foreshadowed in its earliest leaders, and their legacy would haunt Buchenwald long after they were gone. As war loomed in 1939, Buchenwald began to evolve from a single concentration camp into the nucleus of a sprawling network of oppression. What had started as one central facility above Weimar expanded into a web of satellite camps spread across central Germany. These satellite sites, often little more than barracks and barbed wire near factories, became crucial extensions of the main camp. Their purpose was clear: to harness prisoner labor for the Nazi war machine. German industry was hungry for workers, and the SS recognized the economic potential of its captives. Buchenwald became not merely a place of punishment, but a reservoir of manpower, supplying tens of thousands of laborers. Over time, more than 130 satellite camps fell under Buchenwald's control. They ranged from small detachments of a few dozen men to massive labor complexes, employing thousands. Each one deepened the camp's entanglement with Germany's economy. The expansion marked a new phase in Buchenwald's history, the transformation from terror alone to terror fused with profit. The main camp itself was reorganized to support this growing system. Administrative offices expanded, tracking thousands of prisoners transferred daily to and from satellite sites. SS overseers coordinated with civilian industries, striking deals that blurred the line between state and private enterprise. Companies paid the SS for prisoner labor, treating inmates as commodities to be bought and sold. Records reduced human beings to numbers, invoices listing them like livestock rented by the week. The SS profited handsomely, funneling money into its coffers, while businesses benefited from cheap, expendable workers. Buchenwald became a hub of economic exploitation, with trains constantly arriving and departing, ferrying men to their fates in factories, quarries, and armament plants. The rhythm of forced labor became as central to the camp as roll call or punishment. Expansion was not only physical, but systemic, binding Buchenwald to the machinery of war. The camp's shadow now stretched far beyond the fences of Ettersberg Hill. The industries linked to Buchenwald covered a wide spectrum, from construction to armaments, chemicals, and even luxury goods. The SS established workshops inside the camp where prisoners produced everything from uniforms to furniture for their captors. In the satellite camps, labor fed directly into the war effort. Prisoners worked in quarries, extracting stone for military projects, or in factories assembling weapons and munitions. Some were sent to plants run by IG Farben, one of Germany's industrial giants, whose partnership with the SS symbolized the marriage of capital and cruelty. Others labored for smaller firms that profited quietly from the suffering, their names often forgotten, but their gains undeniable. The work was relentless, with shifts stretching up to 12 or 14 hours, regardless of weather or exhaustion. Starvation diets ensured that men grew weaker by the day, yet production quotas never eased. Every strike of the hammer or turn of a machine came at the cost of human lives. Industry's hunger for profit drove the expansion of Buchenwald as much as ideology, economics and brutality became indistinguishable. Satellite camps were deliberately placed close to sites of industrial importance. Some were near quarries, others beside factories or construction projects vital to the Nazi regime. The SS provided the guards, while civilian managers directed the work. For prisoners, the transfer to a satellite camp often meant even harsher conditions than in the main camp. These outposts lacked the minimal infrastructure of Buchenwald, offering little food, no medical care, and almost no oversight. Men slept in overcrowded huts or makeshift shelters, their bodies riddled with lice and disease. Guards treated them with even greater brutality, knowing that isolation shielded their crimes from scrutiny. Death rates in many of these satellites were staggering, with prisoners collapsing on the job and being replaced the next day by new arrivals. To the SS, these camps were not communities, but expendable extensions of Buchenwald's labor pool. Expansion meant spreading terror to every corner of central Germany. Among the most notorious of these satellite camps was Dora Mittelbau, later known as Mittelbau Dora, established to support the V2 rocket program. Prisoners were forced to work in underground tunnels, digging miles of shafts through rock with primitive tools and no ventilation. The conditions were nightmarish. Dust choked the air, lamps flickered in darkness, and men collapsed from exhaustion in the suffocating heat. Thousands died building and assembling the rockets that rained destruction on London and Antwerp. Engineers and SS overseers prioritized speed and secrecy over human life, ensuring that corpses were removed daily as fresh labor replaced them. Mittelbau Dora epitomized the lethal fusion of high technology and slave labor. The expansion of Buchenwald into such sites revealed the regime's willingness to sacrifice countless lives for the illusion of technological victory. Each rocket that left the tunnels carried with it the suffering of those who had built it. The satellite camp system turned scientific progress into an engine of death. Expansion thus linked Buchenwald to the very cutting edge of Nazi warfare. The expansion also altered the demographics of Buchenwald's prisoner population. While the early camp had held primarily German political opponents and so-called asocials, the satellites drew in victims from across occupied Europe: French resistance fighters, Polish prisoners of war, Dutch intellectuals and Soviet captives, swelled the numbers. By 1943, Jews deported from across the continent also began arriving in larger numbers, many sent directly into forced labor. The camp became a crossroads of Europe's suffering, where languages, cultures, and identities converged under the whip of the SS. Expansion ensured that Buchenwald was no longer a German camp for German prisoners, but a European camp of repression. Every nation touched by Nazi conquest was represented within its walls or its satellites. This diversity made survival more complex, but also laid the foundation for international solidarity among prisoners. Expansion turned Buchenwald into a dark mirror of Europe itself. Its barracks and factories became a continent of suffering compressed into barbed wire. The economic exploitation that fueled Buchenwald's expansion also exposed the complicity of German society. Civilian companies relied on prisoner labor, accepting the SS's contracts without questioning the conditions that produced their profits. Factory managers, engineers, and administrators became silent partners in the machinery of terror. Local communities near satellite camps witnessed prisoners marched to work, their gaunt faces and striped uniforms visible reminders of the suffering around them. Some profited directly, supplying food or materials, while others looked away, unwilling to confront the reality. Expansion revealed that the boundary between the camp system and civilian life was porous, blurring guilt across society. The SS could not have maintained such a vast network alone. It required cooperation, silence, and acquiescence. Buchenwald's growth into an economic hub reflected not only Nazi ambition, but widespread complicity. Expansion was not just a story of the SS, but of an entire society entangled in exploitation. Terror became business, and business became terror. By the war's final years, Buchenwald and its satellites held more than 250,000 prisoners, making it one of the largest concentration camp complexes in Nazi Germany. The expansion transformed it from a single camp of terror into a vast archipelago of suffering, spread across fields, quarries, tunnels, and factories. Its reach extended deep into the fabric of the Reich, binding the fate of prisoners to the ambitions of industry and war. The camp became both a symbol and an engine of Nazi brutality, demonstrating how ideology and economics fused seamlessly under the SS. Expansion ensured that Buchenwald was not isolated, but central to Germany's war effort. Every barrack, every satellite, every workshop was part of a larger system designed to extract maximum labor before death. For prisoners, expansion meant despair without escape, as the camp's grip extended across regions and industries. For history, it showed how ordinary businesses became accomplices in atrocity. The expansion of Buchenwald was not merely growth, it was metastasis. The camp became a cancer, spreading through society, feeding on lives. Buchenwald was not simply a prison but a meticulously engineered system of oppression, where every routine, every ritual, and every detail was designed to break the human spirit. The daily rhythm of the camp began and ended with roll calls, exercises in domination, disguised as administrative necessity. Prisoners were driven onto the Appellplatz, the massive roll call square, where they were forced to stand in rigid formation regardless of weather. Whether in scorching summer sun or freezing winter winds, they were compelled to remain motionless for hours until the SS officers were satisfied. Even the sick and dying were dragged out, propped up by comrades or left to collapse in the mud. These roll calls were spectacles of humiliation, not mere counts of numbers. Any discrepancy in the tallies led to endless recitations, forcing prisoners to endure entire nights without food, rest, or shelter. The guards patrolled the lines, beating those who faltered, unleashing dogs on men too weak to stand. For the SS, the roll call was a ritual of total control, a visible reminder that the prisoner body belonged not to itself but to the camp. It was the first and last act of every day, a bookend of cruelty. Punishments in Buchenwald were not random bursts of violence, but codified instruments of terror, carefully staged to intimidate the entire prisoner population. The camp employed a wide array of methods, each calibrated to maximize pain, humiliation, and fear. Whippings were carried out on a special bench, where prisoners were strapped down and beaten with leather whips until their flesh tore open. The number of lashes was often announced publicly, transforming suffering into a performance of SS authority. Another infamous punishment was the tree hanging, where prisoners had their arms tied behind their backs and were suspended by their wrists, often dislocating shoulders or tearing muscles. Death was common in these exercises, yet guards displayed indifference, noting only another number erased. Punishments could be assigned for trivial reasons, failing to march in step, smuggling a piece of bread, or even looking at a guard the wrong way. Each act of brutality reinforced the lesson that survival depended not only on obedience, but on luck. The machinery of punishment was relentless, turning the camp into a stage where terror was rehearsed daily. Its purpose was not discipline, but domination. Executions at Buchenwald were woven seamlessly into the camp's machinery of oppression, staged with cold efficiency to remind prisoners of their expendability. The most infamous method was the Genick-Schuss-Anlage, or neck-shot facility, disguised as a medical examination room. Prisoners were told they were to be measured for height or given checkups, but a concealed gun fired into the back of their heads as they stood against a wall. Corpses were dragged out through a hidden chute, leaving the chamber ready for the next victim. Hangings were also frequent, carried out on gallows erected in the roll call square, ensuring that the entire prisoner population bore witness. These public executions were accompanied by speeches mocking the condemned and warning others of the consequences of disobedience. At times, dozens were executed at once, their bodies left hanging for hours as grotesque symbols of SS authority. The gallows became both punishment and theatre, a ritual designed to instill fear more deeply than words ever could. Death in Buchenwald was not just an endpoint, it was a spectacle. The SS turned killing into a routine part of camp life, woven into its very schedule. The atmosphere of terror was maintained not only through violence but through deliberate unpredictability. Guards shifted rules arbitrarily, ensuring prisoners could never anticipate what would trigger punishment. A gesture tolerated one day could bring a beating the next. A minor infraction could mean days in the bunker, the solitary confinement cells where torture was routine. This instability was itself a weapon, producing a state of permanent anxiety. Prisoners lived in constant uncertainty, knowing that survival depended not on obedience alone, but on avoiding the whims of their captors. Arbitrary cruelty meant that no one felt safe, not even for a moment. Dogs were unleashed on groups without provocation, prisoners were forced into pointless drills, and men were ordered to carry stones back and forth until they collapsed. The randomness of oppression eroded morale, convincing many that resistance was futile. Yet it also fostered solidarity, as prisoners clung to one another for support in a world where rules no longer applied. Buchenwald's terror was therefore not only physical but psychological. It was a war on the mind as much as on the body. The bunker, Buchenwald's special prison within the prison, epitomized the machinery of oppression. Located near the main gate, it contained cells where prisoners endured solitary confinement, starvation, and torture. Darkness, dampness, and silence combined to drive men toward despair. Some cells were so small that prisoners could neither stand upright nor lie down fully, forcing them into agonizing positions for days. Others were subjected to brutal interrogations, beaten until they confessed to crimes real or imagined. Many who entered the bunker never returned, their deaths concealed as accidents or illnesses. For those who survived, the memory of the bunker lingered as the camp's darkest shadow, a place where cruelty was distilled into its purest form. The bunker symbolized the SS obsession with control, not just over behavior, but over thought and spirit. To the prisoners, its looming presence was a constant reminder that worse horrors always awaited. It stood as the innermost chamber of Buchenwald's machinery of terror. Even within a camp of suffering, the bunker was exceptional in its cruelty. The machinery of oppression extended beyond punishments into the daily routines of labor. Prisoners were organized into work details designed not only for productivity, but for destruction. Some tasks were deliberately pointless, such as moving heavy stones from one place to another and then back again, a Sisyphean exercise in exhaustion. Others were lethal, forcing men into quarries, forests, or construction sites with inadequate tools and no protection. The SS openly described this system as extermination through labor, acknowledging that survival was not the goal. The cruelty of the system lay in its dual purpose: to extract as much labor as possible before death, and to break the will of those who survived. Work became a punishment, a weapon, and a death sentence rolled into one. Guards enforced quotas with whips, treating exhaustion as defiance. Men collapsed daily, their bodies carted away to crematoria, while the work continued uninterrupted. Labor was not separate from punishment, but central to the machinery of oppression. Every stroke of the shovel was part of the camp's calculated cruelty. Humiliation was another vital component of the camp's machinery, ensuring that oppression was not only physical, but spiritual. Prisoners were stripped of their names and given numbers, their identities erased and replaced with colored triangles denoting their category. They were forced to march in precise formations, to bow before guards, to endure constant insults. Heads were shaved, clothing was tattered, and individuality was systematically obliterated. Public shaming rituals were staged, forcing men to perform degrading tasks or to stand before others as examples. The SS understood that breaking dignity was as effective as breaking bones. By erasing identity, they hoped to turn prisoners into compliant shells, incapable of resistance. Yet many clung fiercely to scraps of humanity, a whispered prayer, a hidden song, a gesture of solidarity. These small acts of defiance stood as counterweights to humiliation, preserving fragments of spirit amid degradation. Oppression sought to erase the human, but humanity refused to vanish completely. The machinery of terror always faced the quiet resistance of survival. The machinery of oppression at Buchenwald functioned like a well-oiled system, combining ritual, violence, labor, and humiliation into a total environment of control. Roll calls framed the day, punishments and executions punctuated it, and labor drained the body, while unpredictability destroyed the mind. The SS designed every element to reinforce the same message. Prisoners had no power, no identity, and no future beyond suffering. Yet in this relentless machine, sparks of humanity endured, flickering against overwhelming darkness. The very existence of resistance, later in Buchenwald, grew from the shared suffering of these early routines, where men learned to survive by supporting one another. The machinery was vast, but it was not absolute. Even within its grinding gears, life persisted. The camp was a place of destruction, but also of endurance. Terror was the design, but resilience was the unintended byproduct. The machinery of oppression defined Buchenwald, but it did not define the souls of those trapped within it. In Buchenwald, the word medicine was stripped of its meaning and perverted into a tool of cruelty. What should have been an art of healing became an art of torment, where SS doctors turned prisoners into unwilling subjects for experiments masked as research. Behind the barbed wire, the camp became a laboratory of death, with barracks converted into makeshift clinics where no patient was ever cured. Men and women were not treated as human beings, but as biological material, their suffering justified by the ideology of racial science. The SS claimed these experiments were vital for the war effort, presenting them as contributions to medical progress. In reality, they were acts of torture, carried out with complete disregard for human dignity. The experiments left bodies mutilated, minds broken, and lives extinguished. For prisoners, the word doctor inspired fear, not relief. To be chosen for experimentation was often a death sentence disguised as treatment. Buchenwald's medical barracks were not hospitals, but chambers of torment. Among the most infamous experiments were the typhus trials, carried out beginning in 1941, under the direction of SS doctors and researchers from the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS. Typhus, a deadly epidemic disease spread by lice, had plagued armies throughout history, and the Nazis were desperate to develop vaccines. Prisoners were deliberately infected with the disease, injected with strains of typhus, or exposed to lice carrying the bacteria. Once infected, they were either left untreated to study the progression or subjected to experimental vaccines and drugs of unproven safety. The barracks where these trials took place became death wards, filled with fevered men writhing in agony, their bodies drenched in sweat and covered in sores. Guards and doctors observed dispassionately, noting symptoms while ignoring pleas for relief. Dozens died in each round of trials, their corpses dissected for further study. The SS presented these deaths as sacrifices for medical science, but they were nothing more than orchestrated murders. Typhus claimed countless lives inside Buchenwald, both naturally and by design. The trials epitomized the camp's fusion of pseudoscience and barbarity. The role of SS doctors in these experiments was central, revealing the corruption of a profession that should have been devoted to saving life. Men like Dr. Erwin Dingschuler, head of the Hygiene Institute at Buchenwald, supervised the typhus experiments with clinical detachment. Ding kept meticulous records, noting survival times, reactions to vaccines, and post-mortem results, as if cataloguing insects. His barracks became a hub of research, visited by high-ranking SS officials who praised the work as a contribution to the war effort. Yet behind the veneer of scientific progress lay cruelty that defied imagination. Ding was not alone. Other camp doctors, including Waldemar Hoven, conducted experiments and oversaw killings under the guise of medicine. They blurred the line between physician and executioner, embodying the Nazi vision of doctors as soldiers in the war for racial purity. Their white coats concealed hands soaked in blood. To the prisoners, they were not healers but executioners with stethoscopes. Buchenwald became a reminder that science divorced from ethics leads to atrocity. The SS doctors were guardians of death, masquerading as scientists. Beyond typhus, Buchenwald's prisoners were subjected to a wide variety of experiments designed to test drugs, chemicals, and treatments for battlefield conditions. Some were forced to endure poisoning, injected with substances to study the effects of toxins on the human body. Others were deliberately wounded, and then treated with experimental drugs, leaving them to suffer infections or gangrene. Malaria, diphtheria, and other diseases were also inflicted upon prisoners, who were left as untreated controls or given dubious remedies. In many cases, the experiments were sloppy, lacking even the rigor of legitimate science, because the suffering of the subjects mattered more than the results. The SS and their collaborators treated prisoners as limitless resources, bodies to be consumed in the pursuit of knowledge. Survivors described being herded into clinics with no explanation, injected with unknown substances and left to writhe in agony. Death was common, survival rare, and even those who lived carried scars for life. These trials exposed the complete devaluation of human existence under Nazi ideology. In Buchenwald, pain itself became data. Every cry was another entry in a ledger of cruelty. Not all of the experiments were officially sanctioned by Berlin. Some were driven by the curiosity and sadism of individual doctors. Inmates were used as subjects for bizarre tests, ranging from the effects of extreme cold to attempts at castration as a means of curing homosexuality. Hoven, one of Buchenwald's most notorious physicians, became infamous for administering lethal injections to prisoners deemed unfit or inconvenient. His experiments included injecting prisoners with phenol and gasoline directly into the bloodstream, causing immediate death. Hoven justified his killings as part of euthanasia, a twisted extension of the Nazi program to eliminate the weak. Prisoners were selected arbitrarily, their fate sealed with a gesture or a glance. Survivors remembered the cold efficiency of these medical murders, carried out with syringes instead of bullets. Medicine became weaponized, its tools turned into instruments of execution. These acts revealed the depths of moral collapse within the SS Medical Corps. At Buchenwald, science became indistinguishable from murder. The doctors transformed their wards into slaughterhouses. The experimentation did not occur in isolation. It was supported by the broader camp infrastructure, which facilitated both victims and data. Prisoners assigned to the infirmary were forced to serve as assistants, compelled to prepare equipment, dispose of bodies, and record results. Many were forced into complicity, knowing that refusal meant death. The SS carefully controlled access to medical wards, ensuring that secrecy cloaked their crimes. Corpses of victims were sent to the pathology department, where autopsies were performed and body parts preserved for study. The camp crematorium disposed of the remains, erasing evidence while smoke betrayed the scale of death. Files were meticulously maintained, reflecting a grotesque obsession with documentation. These records later became crucial evidence at war crimes trials, but at the time they represented nothing more than the cold bookkeeping of atrocity. Every step from selection to injection, from death to cremation, was integrated into Buchenwald's machinery. The experiments were not chaotic acts of cruelty but organized, systematic procedures. The camp itself became a factory where death was both the process and the product. For the prisoners themselves, the fear of medical selection became an ever-present shadow. The infirmary, which in another world might have been a sanctuary, was often a place of horror. To fall ill meant risking selection for experimentation or euthanasia. Many prisoners avoided reporting sickness, preferring to endure pain rather than risk the attention of doctors. Survivors recalled the silence that fell when names were read for transfer to medical barracks, men disappearing and never returning. Those who survived experiments described lives shattered by chronic illness, disability, and nightmares that never faded. The stigma of being used as human guinea pigs weighed heavily, compounding the trauma of survival. Medical barracks were known among inmates as places of terror equal to the bunker or the gallows. Fear of doctors became a survival instinct, a reversal of the trust that medicine should inspire. The very idea of healing was twisted into horror. Buchenwald turned the hospital into a killing ground. The legacy of Buchenwald's medical experiments is one of profound moral failure, a warning of what happens when science serves ideology instead of humanity. The doctors and researchers cloaked their atrocities in the language of progress, but their results were worthless, tainted by cruelty and devoid of rigor. No true medical breakthrough emerged from the suffering they inflicted. What remained was only a record of inhumanity, At the Nuremberg trials, their crimes were exposed, their notes transformed from scientific reports into evidence of murder. Survivors testified to the agony, ensuring that the victims' voices were not erased with their bodies. The experiments revealed the full corruption of a profession that should protect life, but instead extinguished it. They showed how easily knowledge can be weaponized when ethics are abandoned. The memory of these crimes endures as a warning to generations of scientists and physicians. In Buchenwald, medicine lost its soul. The camp's experiments remain one of the starkest reminders of humanity's descent into barbarity. The arrival of Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald began even before the final solution reached its most radical stage, but their numbers swelled dramatically after 1938. Following Kristallnacht, the nationwide pogrom of November 9th, nearly 10,000 Jewish men were deported to Buchenwald in a sudden wave of terror. Trains unloaded fathers, sons, and grandfathers at the camp's gates, their crime nothing more than their faith and heritage. Many were prominent citizens, shopkeepers, doctors, veterans of the First World War, suddenly reduced to prisoners in striped uniforms. They were beaten upon arrival, shorn of hair, stripped of possessions, and branded with the yellow triangle that marked them as Jews. Conditions were so horrific that hundreds died within weeks, from exposure, disease, and maltreatment. For many, the purpose of this incarceration was not extermination yet, but humiliation and intimidation, intended to terrorize the Jewish community into emigration. Still, the ordeal foreshadowed the horrors to come, as Buchenwald became a staging ground for Jewish suffering. The camp that had begun with political prisoners was now fully entangled with the persecution of Jews. By the early 1940s, as the Nazis implemented Operation Reinhard and the machinery of extermination camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka took shape, Buchenwald assumed a different role. It was not primarily a death camp, but it became an important node in the wider Holocaust system. Jewish deportees were often sent first to Buchenwald for registration, forced labor, or temporary confinement, before being transferred to Auschwitz and other extermination sites. For many, Buchenwald was thus a way station on the road to annihilation. Prisoners remembered the despair of seeing transports leave, knowing those who boarded the cattle cars were unlikely ever to return. The SS used selections ruthlessly, identifying the weak, the elderly, and the sick for transfer east. Those deemed unfit for work were casually consigned to death in extermination camps. For the Jewish inmates who remained in Buchenwald, survival was bound to labor, back-breaking work under starvation conditions. Their presence in the camp underscored how the Nazis integrated Buchenwald into the Holocaust without transforming it into a dedicated killing center. The camp became a cog in the genocide machine. The treatment of Jewish prisoners within Buchenwald itself was marked by deliberate cruelty and segregation. They were often placed in separate barracks, denied access to prisoner networks that offered some protection, and subjected to harsher labor details. The SS delighted in targeting them for humiliation, using anti-Semitic stereotypes to justify their brutality. Jewish prisoners were routinely beaten, given the least food, and forced to endure roll calls long after others had been dismissed. Guards encouraged hostility between prisoner groups, reinforcing divisions that weakened solidarity. The yellow triangle marked them as perpetual targets, stripping away any hope of anonymity. Survivors later described how the mere sight of a yellow triangle invited additional torment from capos as well as guards. The Nazis sought not only to exploit but to degrade, transforming Jews into symbols of supposed inferiority to reinforce their ideology. In Buchenwald, identity determined fate, and Jewish identity carried the heaviest burden. Their lives were defined by exclusion, persecution, and vulnerability at every moment. The influx of Jewish deportees in 1944 marked one of the darkest phases of Buchenwald's history. As Allied armies advanced and the Nazis evacuated other camps, thousands of Jews were sent to Buchenwald in chaotic waves. Transports arrived from Auschwitz, from the liquidated ghettos of Eastern Europe, and from satellite camps that could no longer function. Overcrowding reached catastrophic levels, with barracks built for hundreds crammed with thousands. Starvation spread rapidly, typhus epidemics swept the camp, and death tolls soared. The crematoriums, already burning day and night, struggled to keep pace with the bodies delivered daily. Prisoners described piles of corpses stacked like wood, a grim testament to the scale of suffering. For many Jews, Buchenwald became the final stop, not through systematic gassing, but through starvation, disease, and neglect. The camp thus reflected the diversity of the Holocaust's methods, where industrialized extermination was joined by extermination through abandonment. Survival was nearly impossible, as cruelty and chaos consumed all. The arrival of Jews in 1944 transformed Buchenwald into a site of catastrophic mortality. Selections within Buchenwald were carried out with chilling regularity, as SS doctors and guards determined who might live another day, and who would be sent to death. Jewish prisoners, already weakened by transport and deprivation, were prime targets for these selections. Infirmaries, instead of being sanctuaries, became traps where the sick were identified for removal. The chosen were marched to trains bound for Auschwitz or Majdanek, their fates sealed the moment their names were read. Sometimes selections occurred in the roll call square, with guards pulling men from the ranks at random. The uncertainty gnawed at morale, ensuring that every day was lived under the shadow of imminent death. Survivors recalled the silence that fell as names were called, a silence broken only by the barking of dogs and the shouts of guards. For those not selected, relief was tempered by guilt, knowing they had been spared while friends and family were condemned. Selections became rituals of despair, rehearsals of death that reinforced the sense of inevitability. In Buchenwald, survival was never secure. It was always provisional. Children were among the Jewish prisoners who arrived at Buchenwald, many of them orphans from Eastern Europe. Their survival often depended on extraordinary efforts by older prisoners, particularly political inmates, who used their positions to shield them. In the infamous Kinderblock, Block 66, children were hidden from SS scrutiny, protected by the clandestine networks of the camp's underground resistance. These efforts saved hundreds of young lives, ensuring that not all were lost in the machinery of genocide. Yet for many others, childhood ended at the camp gates, replaced by hunger, fear, and forced labor. Boys as young as 12 were sent to quarries or factories, their small bodies broken by work meant for grown men. Others were caught in selections and sent east to die in Auschwitz. Survivors who were children in Buchenwald later recalled the terror of their days, but also the extraordinary solidarity that offered fleeting glimpses of hope. Their presence revealed both the depth of Nazi cruelty and the resilience of prisoner humanity. Children became the most poignant victims of Buchenwald's role in the Holocaust. Their voices haunt history with innocence stolen. The scale of Jewish suffering at Buchenwald is difficult to measure, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Jews passed through the camp, many perishing within its fences. Mortality was driven by deliberate starvation, unchecked disease, brutal labor, and deportations to extermination camps. The crematoriums consumed Jewish bodies day and night, their ashes scattered into pits or used as fertilizer, erasing physical traces while memory endured. Survivors described the stench of burning flesh drifting across the camp, a constant reminder of mortality. For the SS, these deaths were not tragedies, but statistics, recorded meticulously in ledgers that reduced human lives to numbers. Yet despite the enormity of suffering, some prisoners clung to survival, sustaining one another with scraps of food, whispered prayers, and fragments of solidarity. Jewish inmates formed bonds that defied Nazi efforts to erase their humanity, preserving identity even in the face of annihilation. Their endurance became a form of resistance, a refusal to vanish without a trace. In the machinery of the Holocaust, even survival was an act of defiance. Buchenwald's Jewish prisoners carried that defiance amid devastation. Buchenwald's role in the Holocaust was complex, a mixture of extermination through neglect and exploitation through labor. It was not Auschwitz, with its gas chambers and crematoria designed solely for mass killing, but it was nonetheless part of the same genocidal system. Its Jewish prisoners were subjected to selections, deportations, and conditions calculated to destroy them. The camp's expansion into forced labor linked their suffering directly to the German war effort, turning genocide into industry. Yet Buchenwald also revealed glimpses of prisoner solidarity, as political inmates and underground networks sought to protect Jewish comrades when possible. This tension between annihilation and survival, cruelty and solidarity, defined the Jewish experience of Buchenwald. The camp stood as both a site of destruction and a site of endurance. Its Jewish prisoners embodied the Holocaust dual realities, the systematic effort to erase a people, and the stubborn persistence of life. In their stories, Buchenwald becomes not only a place of death, but also a place of memory. Their suffering ensures that the camp's role in the Holocaust is never forgotten. Forced labor was not a byproduct of Buchenwald. It was one of its central purposes, a mechanism that transformed human beings into raw materials for the Nazi war effort. As the Second World War intensified, the Reich's industries demanded more workers, and the SS provided them by enslaving prisoners. Companies such as IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens struck deals with the SS, paying for laborers as if they were tools rented for a job. Buchenwald became a reservoir of manpower, its prisoners dispatched daily to factories, quarries, and workshops. The ideology of extermination through work guided this system. Prisoners were worked to death, replaced by new arrivals when their bodies gave out. This arrangement provided profit for corporations, revenue for the SS, and devastation for the prisoners. Work assignments were not random, they were carefully calibrated to maximize exhaustion and minimize survival. The camp thus became both a prison and a labor camp, where every breath was measured against productivity. For prisoners, labor was not only a burden, but a death sentence in disguise. Buchenwald turned sweat, blood, and suffering into weapons of war. IG Farben, one of Germany's industrial giants, was among the companies that profited from Buchenwald's expansion. The conglomerate, known for producing synthetic rubber, chemicals, and fuel, required massive amounts of labor, which the SS supplied in exchange for cash payments. Prisoners were marched daily to Farben's factories, where they mixed chemicals without protective gear, their lungs seared by toxic fumes. Burns, blindness, and chemical poisoning were routine, yet production never slowed. Other prisoners were assigned to construct industrial plants, laying foundations with bare hands and primitive tools. Many collapsed under the weight of bricks or steel beams, their deaths treated as accidents rather than crimes. Farben's partnership with the SS symbolized the entanglement of modern industry with genocide, where corporate ambition fed directly on human misery. Buchenwald's prisoners were stripped of humanity, reduced to cost-effective units of labor. Each barrel of synthetic fuel and each batch of chemicals carried the hidden toll of lives consumed. The collaboration between business and the SS revealed the economic engine behind forced labor. Industrial profit was built on a foundation of corpses, Weapons production was a cornerstone of Buchenwald's forced labor system, linking the camp directly to the battlefields of Europe. Prisoners assembled rifles, machine guns, and artillery shells, often without training, under the constant watch of guards. Mistakes, inevitable under starvation and exhaustion, were punished with beatings or death. Some worked in armaments plants, producing vital components for the Luftwaffe, laboring in deafening workshops filled with smoke and dust. Others were dispatched to the nearby Gustloff Worker, a major arms factory where prisoners produced firearms in staggering quantities. The irony was bitter. Men who had been stripped of freedom were forced to forge the weapons that ensured their oppression. The SS celebrated efficiency, praising managers who increased output, while prisoners paid the price in blood and bone. To the Reich, each weapon produced was a step toward victory. To the prisoners, it was another nail in the coffin of their humanity. War and genocide thus became indistinguishable. Every bullet that left the factory floor bore the imprint of suffering. The battlefield and the camp were linked through labor. The daily routine of forced labor was designed to grind prisoners into dust. The day began with roll call in the freezing pre-dawn, where prisoners stood for hours before being marched to their assignments. Work details stretched from dawn until dusk, often 12 to 14 hours with only brief pauses. Food rations consisted of watery soup, a crust of bread or coffee made from acorns, far too little to sustain the exertion demanded. Prisoners staggered under loads of stone, timber, or metal, their emaciated bodies failing under impossible tasks. Quarries in particular became sites of slow-motion execution, where men hacked at stone until they collapsed. Guards patrolled constantly, striking with rifle butts or unleashing dogs on those who faltered. The return march to camp was no reprieve. Prisoners were beaten for failing to keep pace, even as they stumbled with exhaustion. At night, men returned to overcrowded barracks too weak to eat, collapsing into sleep haunted by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same. Work was not survival but a cycle of death prolonged. Forced labor was slavery refined into a system. The philosophy behind this system was encapsulated in the phrase Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. To the SS, prisoners were not workers to be preserved, but bodies to be consumed until nothing remained. Productivity was measured not in efficiency, but in how much could be extracted from a human being before he perished. Records revealed quotas impossible to meet, ensuring that starvation, exhaustion, and punishment thinned the ranks constantly. Death on the job was not a failure but an expectation, as guards noted corpses as casually as completed tasks. Each prisoner represented a finite reserve of energy to be spent recklessly in pursuit of production. The ideology was clear. The work itself was the method of killing, the factory or quarry serving as a chamber of death in slow motion. This system bound economic exploitation and genocide together into a single strategy. Labor camps like Buchenwald became essential complements to extermination camps, killing not by gas but by grindstone. Extermination through labor was both policy and practice. It defined Buchenwald's role in the Nazi Empire. Satellite camps multiplied to supply labor directly to industrial sites, spreading Buchenwald's shadow across central Germany. These outposts were often more lethal than the main camp, lacking medical facilities, food supplies, or oversight. Prisoners lived in makeshift huts near factories, marching directly to work under the eyes of guards. Death rates were staggering, as starvation combined with brutal hours and dangerous conditions. Mittelbau-Dora, perhaps the most infamous satellite, forced prisoners to dig tunnels for the V2 rocket program, a project hailed by the Nazis as a wonder weapon. In reality, the tunnels became underground tombs, filled with choking dust, collapsing rock, and corpses carried out daily. Thousands perished so that rockets could be launched at London and Antwerp, each missile carrying with it the lives of those who built it. Expansion of the satellite system revealed the SS commitment to labor as a form of extermination. Every factory became an annex of the camp, every worksite another front of cruelty. Buchenwald's reach extended far beyond its barbed wire. Forced labor metastasized across the Reich. Prisoners themselves developed strategies to endure the crushing burden of labor, clinging to life in small but significant ways. Some attempted to sabotage production, subtly damaging tools or assembling defective weapons. Such acts were dangerous, often punished with execution if discovered, yet they offered a means of resistance. Others formed clandestine networks to share food, swapping extra crumbs or smuggling potatoes from kitchens to sustain the weakest. Prisoners with positions of relative authority, such as clerks or cappers sympathetic to the underground, sometimes shielded others from the harshest assignments. Songs, whispered prayers, and small gestures of solidarity helped maintain morale, even as bodies wasted away. For many, survival depended on cooperation, one man helping another lift a stone, or covering for a comrade who stumbled. Labor was intended to atomize and destroy, yet it occasionally forged bonds of resilience. Against the machinery of exploitation, humanity found ways to persist. Survival itself became resistance. Each act of endurance was a refusal to be consumed entirely by forced labor. The role of forced labor in Buchenwald stands as one of the clearest indictments of Nazi cruelty and complicity. The camp's economic partnerships exposed how corporations and industries knowingly participated in exploitation, benefiting from death as though it were a resource. The SS perfected a system where profit and ideology intertwined, proving that genocide was not only racial but also economic. For prisoners, labor defined every hour of existence, shaping their suffering and their struggle to endure. It was not merely work, but a process of slow annihilation, stripping the body and crushing the spirit. Yet even in this system, sparks of defiance flickered, as prisoners sabotaged, resisted, or simply endured longer than their oppressors intended. Forced labor turned Buchenwald into both a killing ground and an industrial engine. Its legacy is inseparable from the weapons produced and the lives destroyed. The factories of the Reich carried with them the ashes of the camp. In Buchenwald, labor was death disguised as work. Within the walls of Buchenwald, where violence and starvation sought to erase all traces of humanity, prisoners found ways to resist that went beyond sabotage or escape. This resistance took the form of culture, fragile acts of creativity that preserved identity and dignity against a system designed to annihilate both. Men who had once been teachers, poets, musicians, or students brought fragments of their old lives into the barracks, transforming suffering into expression. They whispered lessons in mathematics and history, sang songs beneath their breath, and scribbled lines of poetry on scraps of stolen paper. These small acts were illegal, punishable by beatings or death, but they continued in defiance of the SS. For the prisoners, culture was more than distraction. It was survival. It reminded them they were still human beings, capable of thought and beauty, even amid filth and brutality. Every verse, every melody, every story told was a refusal to be reduced to a number. In the darkest conditions, the human spirit proved resilient. Cultural resistance became the invisible heartbeat of Buchenwald. One of the most remarkable forms of resistance was the creation of secret schools inside the barracks. Educated prisoners, often former professors, teachers, or intellectuals, gave clandestine lessons to others, particularly to younger inmates, using charcoal on scraps of paper or even scratching lessons into the dirt. They taught languages, history, geography, and science. These makeshift classrooms often met at night, After the back-breaking hours of forced labor, when men were barely able to keep their eyes open. Yet the hunger for knowledge was stronger than exhaustion. For the children imprisoned in Block 66, the so-called Kinderblock, these secret lessons were lifelines, preserving not just their minds but their hope for a world beyond the barbed wire. Teaching was an act of rebellion, proving that education could endure where ignorance and brutality reigned. The SS sought to erase identities and futures, but each secret lesson affirmed that prisoners still believed in tomorrow. Even in the camp, the classroom survived. It was a beacon of resilience in a place of despair. Music was another form of defiance, echoing quietly through the barracks, despite the constant threat of punishment. Prisoners composed songs in whispers, altering folk tunes or inventing melodies that carried coded messages of hope. Some fashioned crude instruments from scraps of wood or metal, risking severe retribution to produce even a few notes. In the evenings, exhausted men sometimes hummed choralas, lullabies, or revolutionary anthems under their breath, the sound blending into the background noise of the camp. At times music erupted more boldly. Prisoners in work details sang in unison, turning forced marches into acts of solidarity. For Jewish inmates, traditional Hebrew songs and prayers kept faith alive even when survival seemed impossible. Each note was more than sound. It was an act of defiance, a declaration that the Nazis could not strip the spirit from the body. Survivors recalled how a single song could lift morale across an entire barrack. Music did not erase hunger or cold, but it gave meaning to endurance. In Buchenwald, melody became rebellion. Poetry and storytelling flourished in the shadows, creating a literary underground that challenged despair with words. Prisoners memorized verses, reciting them quietly in groups, or whispering them to themselves while standing at roll call. Some wrote original poems on scraps of cement sacks, tissue paper, or even etched them into wood with nails. These writings were often hidden in cracks of the barracks, or passed secretly between comrades. Storytelling was equally vital, as prisoners shared memories of home, tales of history, or even improvised fiction to entertain one another during long nights. These narratives connected men to their pasts and their cultures, weaving a fabric of meaning in a world stripped bare of humanity. Even when written words were destroyed, memory preserved them, carried in the minds of survivors who later testified. The Nazis could silence books but not stories, could burn libraries but not memory. Every whispered poem was a weapon against erasure. In Buchenwald, literature survived the flames. Art, too, found its place behind barbed wire, though it often emerged in secret and fragile forms. Prisoners sketched with charcoal stolen from kitchens, drew on scraps of paper, or carved images into wood or stone. Some drawings depicted daily life in the camp. Skeletal figures at roll call, guards looming with whips, bodies carried to crematoria. Others turned to images of memory and hope, landscapes of villages left behind, portraits of family members, or visions of freedom. These works were dangerous. If discovered, they could bring severe punishment, as the SS feared visual documentation of their crimes. Yet prisoners persisted, hiding sketches in mattresses or burying them near the barracks. After liberation, some of these artworks resurfaced, offering a haunting record of suffering and resilience. They are among the most powerful artifacts of Buchenwald today, evidence that creativity endured in defiance of terror. Art became both a testimony and a lifeline. Every line drawn was an act of resistance. In silence, images spoke louder than words. Religious rituals, though forbidden, also played a vital role in cultural resistance. Jewish prisoners recited prayers from memory, whispered during roll call, or before collapsing into sleep. Christian inmates organized clandestine services, with sermons improvised in the barracks and psalms sung softly after lights out. These acts carried immense risk, but they preserved faith amid despair. Religion became a way to sustain identity, to affirm that life retained meaning even when death seemed certain. Survivors recalled the comfort of shared prayers, how a whispered psalm or Kaddish bound prisoners together across differences of language or nationality. Spiritual resistance was not only about belief in God, but about defiance of Nazi ideology, which sought to strip prisoners of dignity. Rituals reminded men and women that they were more than captives, they were part of traditions that had endured for centuries. The Nazis could dominate bodies but could not conquer the soul. Faith became rebellion. Every prayer whispered in Buchenwald was a declaration of survival. Small acts of kindness, woven into daily routines, were themselves expressions of cultural resistance. A prisoner sharing a crust of bread, another covering a comrade during roll call, or a group hiding a sick man from SS inspections. These gestures preserved humanity in a system built to destroy it. Even humor, whispered jokes about guards or the absurdities of camp life, became a means of survival. Prisoners mocked their captors in private, turning fear into laughter that momentarily lifted the crushing weight of despair. These small acts may have seemed insignificant, but they represented a defiance as powerful as sabotage. They declared that dignity, solidarity, and compassion could not be eradicated by terror. Survivors later recalled that it was these gestures, more than anything, that allowed them to endure. The cultural resistance of Buchenwald was not grand or spectacular. It was woven into the quiet determination to remain human. Every act of kindness was a protest. Every laugh in the dark was victory over the system of annihilation. Humanity survived in fragments, but it survived nonetheless. Cultural resistance behind barbed wire was not about defeating the SS with weapons, but about outlasting them with spirit. In secret schools, whispered songs, hidden sketches, and shared prayers, prisoners reclaimed fragments of the humanity that the Nazis sought to erase. These acts did not topple the camp system, but they weakened its ultimate goal, the destruction of identity and hope. Each lesson taught, each poem recited, each prayer uttered became an affirmation that life retained meaning even in the face of annihilation. Survivors testified that these small cultural gestures often made the difference between despair and endurance. They gave prisoners a reason to continue, a vision of a future where the barbed wire would rust and the watchtowers would crumble. Buchenwald's machinery of oppression was vast, but it could not silence the creativity of the human spirit. Culture became rebellion, resilience, and survival all at once. In remembering these acts, we remember not only the suffering, but the strength of those imprisoned. Their cultural resistance remains one of Buchenwald's most enduring legacies. Buchenwald was not only a place of suffering, but also of resistance, where prisoners forged clandestine networks under the eyes of their captors. At the heart of this resistance stood the International Prisoners Committee, an underground organization that transcended national, political, and linguistic barriers. It was composed primarily of political prisoners, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and intellectuals, who had been among the earliest inmates. These men, seasoned by years of struggle against fascism, brought organizational discipline into the camp. Their vision was bold: to protect the weakest prisoners, to sabotage the Nazi war effort, and ultimately to prepare for liberation. They met in secret, using whispers, coded signals, and clandestine notes smuggled between barracks. Each act of planning carried the risk of torture and execution if discovered. Yet they persisted, convinced that survival without resistance was meaningless. In the shadow of crematoria smoke, they built a government in waiting for a free world beyond the barbed wire. The International Prisoners Committee became Buchenwald's invisible heart of defiance. The diversity of the committee gave it strength, reflecting the international nature of the prisoner population. Germans, Poles, Frenchmen, Dutch, Belgians, Czechs, and even Soviet prisoners of war collaborated within its ranks. Despite differing political ideologies, they were united by a common enemy, Nazism. Language barriers were overcome with whispered translations and hand signals, while political differences were set aside in favor of solidarity. Leadership often rotated to ensure security, with each nationality contributing intelligence, manpower, or contacts within the camp. The Germans provided knowledge of local conditions and SS procedures. The French and Belgians smuggled news from the outside. The Soviets brought military experience from the front. The committee's very existence defied Nazi ideology, which sought to pit nations and peoples against one another. Here, under brutal conditions, they built a coalition across borders. It was both a survival mechanism and a vision of international unity in embryo. In Buchenwald, Europe's divided nations rehearsed the cooperation that would shape the post-war world. The committee's primary mission was survival, and to achieve it, they devised ingenious strategies to shield prisoners from the camp's machinery of death. They infiltrated the camp's prisoner functionary system, positioning sympathetic kapos, clerks, and foremen in key roles. By manipulating records, they could save lives, erasing names from transport lists, assigning easier work details, or hiding children in safer barracks. They smuggled extra food to the sick, protected vulnerable inmates from SS brutality, and provided false identities to Jews and others marked for death. These interventions were subtle but life-saving, preserving thousands who might otherwise have perished. Every forged document, every delayed transport, every stolen potato was an act of resistance. The committee demonstrated that resistance did not always mean violence. It could mean quiet subversion of bureaucracy. Their control of paperwork and camp administration became a shield behind which life endured. The International Prisoners Committee transformed the camp's own systems into weapons of survival. Resistance became woven into the very fabric of daily life. Smuggling was another vital lifeline for the committee. Information, food, and even medicine were secretly exchanged through networks of trust. Prisoners who worked in workshops crafted hidden compartments in tools or garments, while those assigned to outside labor details slipped messages past guards. Resistance groups outside the camp occasionally established tenuous contact, passing in newspapers or scraps of radio information that carried news of Allied advances. This information was shared discreetly among prisoners, keeping hope alive in a place where despair reigned. Knowledge of the outside world was as valuable as bread, proving that the Reich was not invincible. Smuggled medicines helped treat the sick, while stolen supplies allowed the committee to prepare for emergencies. Each act of smuggling risked brutal punishment, but the networks persisted. Prisoners learned to outwit guards with ingenuity born of desperation. The flow of contraband sustained the body and the spirit alike. Smuggling was both a rebellion and a promise of survival. As the war dragged on and rumors of Germany's impending defeat spread, the International Prisoners Committee began to think beyond survival to preparation for liberation. They secretly trained men in military discipline, using veterans of the Spanish Civil War and Soviet POWs as instructors. Wooden sticks became rifles in these clandestine drills, carried out under the cover of labor details. The committee stockpiled weapons wherever possible: knives, makeshift clubs, even pistols stolen from inattentive guards. The aim was not a full-scale uprising like that at Sobibor or Treblinka, but readiness to seize control of the camp at the decisive moment. Planning was carried out with caution, for premature discovery would mean massacre. Yet the committee's growing organization reflected both hope and determination. They were not content to wait passively for Allied tanks. They envisioned themselves as agents of their own liberation. Resistance, once focused on survival, expanded to embrace strategy. In the heart of Buchenwald, prisoners planned for freedom. The committee's influence reached even into the treatment of children. One of the most vulnerable groups in the camp, Block 66, the children's barrack, was placed under the protection of prisoner leaders connected to the underground. Here the committee shielded boys, many of them Jewish orphans, from transport lists and brutal work assignments. Teachers and intellectuals within the committee organized secret lessons, ensuring that education continued even in the camp. Older prisoners watched over the younger, providing scraps of food, blankets, and protection from the SS. The committee recognized that saving children meant preserving the future, a symbolic act of resistance against the Nazi project of extermination. Survivors later testified that without the underground, many of them would not have lived. Block 66 became a sanctuary amid horror, a victory of solidarity against annihilation. The committee's care for children revealed its broader vision. Resistance was not only about weapons or sabotage, but about preserving life. Protecting the young was defiance in its purest form. The International Prisoners Committee also provided a framework for moral and psychological resistance, reminding prisoners that they were part of something larger than themselves. Secret meetings emphasized solidarity, discipline, and the belief that the Nazi system would eventually collapse. The committee spread coded messages urging prisoners to hold on, to endure, to resist despair. This psychological resistance was as crucial as any weapon, for it kept alive the will to survive. Prisoners learned that their suffering was not isolated but part of a collective struggle against tyranny. The committee embodied this unity, turning scattered individuals into a community with purpose. Its very existence gave hope to thousands who might otherwise have succumbed to hopelessness. Through organization, they created meaning in a world designed to erase it. Resistance thus became not just a strategy, but a way of life. In Buchenwald, unity was the antidote to annihilation. By 1944 and 1945, as the Third Reich staggered toward defeat, the International Prisoners Committee had grown into a formidable underground government within Buchenwald. It managed communication, smuggling, survival strategies, and even plans for armed defense. When liberation finally came in April 1945, the committee played a decisive role in seizing control of the camp, ensuring order and protecting prisoners until Allied troops arrived. Their achievement was extraordinary. In the very heart of the Nazi system, under constant surveillance, they had created a functioning underground state. It revealed the extraordinary resilience of political prisoners, whose organizational skills turned despair into defiance. The committee's legacy extended far beyond liberation, as survivors later carried its spirit into post-war reconstruction and memory. In the ashes of Buchenwald, they had planted the seeds of solidarity that transcended borders. Their work proved that even in a camp of death, unity could become life. The International Prisoners Committee remains one of the most remarkable stories of resistance in the history of the Holocaust. It was proof that organization itself was rebellion. Daily life in Buchenwald was structured not around comfort or order, but around deprivation and despair. A calculated system meant to break both body and spirit. The barracks, long wooden huts crammed with bunks, were designed to house a few hundred men, but often contained over 1,000. Prisoners slept 3 to a bed, stacked on hard planks, with little more than filthy straw as bedding. Blankets were scarce, and in winter icy drafts cut through the walls, leaving men shivering through the night. The air inside the barracks was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and sickness, never cleared because windows were nailed shut. Lice and fleas infested the bedding, spreading disease with every scratch of a prisoner's skin. Lights remained dim, adding to the sense of suffocating gloom, where days bled into nights without relief. Silence was broken only by coughs, groans, and the barking of guards at dawn. To live in the barracks was to endure overcrowding, filth, and the slow erosion of dignity. Every night was a battle for rest, and every morning began in exhaustion. Food was both meager and humiliating, deliberately designed to starve rather than nourish. Breakfast consisted of a thin, bitter coffee, brewed from roasted acorns or chicory, served lukewarm in dented metal bowls. Lunch was usually a watery soup made of turnip peels, rotting cabbage, or potato skins, barely enough to fill the stomach. Dinner offered little more than a small crust of black bread, sometimes accompanied by a smear of margarine or a slice of sausage, so thin it was transparent. Rations amounted to barely 1,200 calories a day, far below what was needed for men, forced into grueling labor. Hunger gnawed constantly, consuming thoughts and conversations alike, as prisoners dreamed of meals they would never taste. Many traded possessions for food, bartering bits of clothing, or even labor for an extra crust of bread. The powerful, capos, clerks, or those with access to kitchens, sometimes secured slightly better portions, deepening inequalities among prisoners. Starvation hollowed cheeks, weakened bodies, and made survival a daily gamble. Food was not sustenance, but another weapon of oppression. Disease thrived in the conditions of filth, overcrowding, and starvation. Typhus, spread by lice, swept through the camp in waves, leaving barracks filled with fevered, delirious men. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed thousands more, spreading unchecked through shared bedding and contaminated water. The infirmary, far from being a refuge, often served as a death trap, where prisoners were abandoned to die or used as subjects in medical experiments. Doctors sometimes withheld treatment altogether, recording the deaths as statistics in camp ledgers. Medicines were scarce, and when available, often distributed according to favoritism or corruption rather than need. Prisoners learned to rely on one another for rudimentary care, wiping sweat, whispering encouragement, or sharing food to strengthen the sick. Yet many were too weak to help, forced to watch helplessly as comrades wasted away. The stench of disease became part of daily life, a reminder that death was never far. Illness in Buchenwald was not misfortune, it was inevitability. Survival meant navigating a world where disease was as lethal as bullets. Sanitation was nearly non-existent, adding to the spread of illness and the erosion of dignity. Latrines overflowed, with dozens of prisoners forced to relieve themselves in shallow trenches or crude wooden structures shared by hundreds. Water was limited, often muddy or contaminated, and bathing was a rare luxury. Soap, when available, was issued in pieces so small they dissolved after a single use. Prisoners were ordered to maintain cleanliness during inspections, yet given no means to achieve it, making failure inevitable and punishable. The result was a perpetual stench that clung to barracks, clothing, and skin alike. Lice and fleas infested every surface, spreading typhus and causing relentless itching. Clothes went unwashed for months, becoming stiff with filth and riddled with vermin. Guards mocked prisoners for their uncleanliness, a cruelty that compounded humiliation. The collapse of hygiene in Buchenwald was not accidental. It was part of the machinery of degradation. Dirt became another tool of oppression. The daily schedule was rigid, dictated by the shrill blasts of whistles and the shouted commands of guards. Before dawn, prisoners were herded out for roll call, forced to stand in endless lines regardless of rain, snow, or freezing winds. Hours could pass before counts were completed, especially if numbers did not match. The weak and sick often collapsed, their bodies dragged away while the living remained frozen in place. After roll call, work details began, sending thousands to quarries, factories, and construction sites. Lunch, if it arrived, was consumed on the job, watery soup slurped hastily from dented cans. The evening roll call repeated the morning's ordeal, forcing exhausted men to stand again until numbers satisfied the SS. Nights offered little reprieve, as prisoners crammed into bunks, fighting off lice and the cold. The routine was relentless, stripping away individuality and replacing it with monotony. In Buchenwald, the passage of time itself became a form of punishment. Every day mirrored the last in its cruelty. Survival strategies emerged in this hostile environment, shaped by instinct, solidarity, and ingenuity. Prisoners formed small groups known as comradeships, where members shared food, guarded one another during roll call, and offered emotional support. These networks increased chances of survival, as isolation often meant despair. Political prisoners with positions of influence sometimes used their authority to shield others from the harshest labor details. Skilled workers, if they could prove useful in workshops, secured slightly better conditions, gaining access to tools, shelter, or scraps of food. Some prisoners resorted to bartering, trading valuables smuggled into the camp for sustenance or favors. Others engaged in quiet acts of sabotage, deliberately slowing production as a way to resist while preserving strength. For many, survival depended on a combination of luck and strategy, navigating camp hierarchies with care. Solidarity was often the only defense against despair, reminding prisoners that they were not entirely alone. In a system designed to destroy, cooperation became an act of rebellion. Survival was never guaranteed, but it was fought for each day. The psychological burden of daily life weighed heavily, eroding minds as much as bodies. Constant hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation fostered a climate of despair that led some to give up entirely, slipping into apathy or suicide. The sight of corpses carried past each day reminded prisoners of their own fragile hold on life. Yet others clung fiercely to hope, finding strength in memory, faith, or small acts of resistance. Conversations about food, family, or the future became coping mechanisms, distracting minds from the relentless present. Prisoners created imaginary meals, describing recipes in detail, as if conjuring nourishment through words alone. Humor, though dangerous, sometimes surfaced in whispered jokes, mocking guards or camp absurdities. Faith rituals, cultural songs, and whispered prayers preserved fragments of identity. These psychological strategies offered a shield against despair, even if only for moments. The human mind became its own battlefield in Buchenwald. Survival required not just a strong body, but a resilient spirit. Daily life in Buchenwald was thus a paradox of destruction and endurance, where systems of oppression sought to strip away humanity, yet could not erase it entirely. The barracks, food, disease, and work routines all combined into a machinery designed to kill slowly and efficiently. Yet within this machinery, prisoners carved out spaces of resistance, in friendships, in whispered songs, in the simple act of helping one another survive. Every day was both a trial and a triumph, a struggle against hunger, filth, and despair. The monotony of cruelty was pierced by fleeting moments of solidarity and dignity. Buchenwald survivors later recalled not only the suffering but the small acts that made life bearable. These stories reveal that the camp was not merely a site of annihilation, but also of resilience. The rhythm of daily life was meant to crush, but it also forged bonds of defiance. Life in Buchenwald was a daily negotiation with death. Yet even in that world, humanity endured. Among the most infamous names associated with Buchenwald was Ilse Koch, the wife of Commandant Koch, whose cruelty and extravagance earned her the nickname the Witch of Buchenwald. She became notorious for her sadistic behavior, wandering the camp on horseback, whip in hand, striking prisoners at will. Survivors remembered how she selected inmates for arbitrary punishments, ordering them beaten or executed on whims. Rumors spread that she delighted in bizarre cruelties, such as forcing prisoners to crawl naked through nettles or mocking the dying with laughter. Her influence extended beyond sadism. She lived in luxury near the camp, in a villa surrounded by suffering. She decorated her home with items taken from prisoners, flaunting jewelry, clothing, and valuables stolen from the dead. Even among the SS, Ilse was infamous for excess, representing the grotesque corruption that flourished within Buchenwald. Her name became a symbol of the moral decay that permeated the Nazi system. To the prisoners, she embodied cruelty, personalized into a single figure. The Witch of Buchenwald was both real and myth, feeding the camp's darkest legends. One of the most enduring myths associated with Ilse Koch was the story of human skin lampshades, which shocked the world after liberation. Survivors testified that she ordered tattooed prisoners killed so their skin could be turned into ornaments, binding books or decorating lamps in her home. Allied investigators uncovered items made of human skin at Buchenwald, fueling the sensational claim that she had turned atrocity into decoration. While later trials revealed that direct proof linking Koch to these specific objects was thin, the myth persisted as a symbol of Nazi barbarity. The controversy illustrated the difficulty of disentangling fact from rumor in the aftermath of horror. What was beyond doubt, however, was that human skin had indeed been preserved, and Ilse's sadism gave credibility to the allegations. The lampshade story captured global attention, amplifying her infamy beyond that of most other SS figures. Whether wholly true or exaggerated, it spoke to the grotesque corruption of the camp system. Buchenwald itself had become synonymous with cruelty industrialized into spectacle. Ilse Koch's legend still lingers as the most infamous of all camp myths. Ilse's husband, Karl Otto Koch, was equally reviled, though for different reasons. As Commandant of Buchenwald from 1937 to 1941, he oversaw the construction and early expansion of the camp. Koch was known less for flamboyant sadism and more for systematic corruption, enriching himself through embezzlement, theft, and exploitation of prisoner labor. He siphoned off gold, valuables, and money confiscated from inmates, funneling wealth into his personal accounts. His villa near the camp became a palace of ill-gotten luxury, a grotesque contrast to the barracks filled with starving men. Koch's greed was so blatant that even the SS could not ignore it. Heinrich Himmler eventually ordered an investigation into his corruption, leading to his arrest in 1941. He was later convicted of embezzlement and executed by the SS itself in 1945, a rare example of Nazi justice turned inward. Karl Otto Koch's downfall revealed that even in a system of legalized atrocity, theft from the Reich was intolerable. His career embodied the marriage of cruelty and corruption that defined Buchenwald. Greed for him was as lethal as ideology. Ilse Koch, however, escaped the same fate as her husband during the war, continuing her life of luxury and influence. After Karl's downfall, she remained at Buchenwald, wielding power as the commandant's wife, feared by prisoners and respected by SS officers. She embodied the toxic blend of privilege and sadism, untouchable within the insulated world of the camp. Survivors remembered her striding confidently across the Appellplatz, a symbol of authority in a system where authority meant life or death. Even after the war, her legend endured, as she became one of the few women prosecuted for crimes against humanity. In 1947, she was tried by an American military tribunal in Dachau, where witnesses described her cruelty in chilling detail. Convicted of war crimes, she was sentenced to life imprisonment, only to have her sentence controversially reduced by US authorities in 1948. Public outrage forced her rearrest by German courts, where she faced new charges. Her notoriety ensured she would remain in prison until her death in 1967. Ilse Koch's legacy was one of enduring infamy. The Kochs were not alone in shaping Buchenwald's reputation for cruelty and corruption. Figures like Hermann Pfister, who succeeded Karl Otto Koch as commandant, maintained the camp's brutal efficiency until liberation. Pfister lacked the flamboyance of his predecessors, but oversaw the camp during its bloodiest years, when tens of thousands perished through labor, disease, and starvation. Under his command, Buchenwald reached its peak as an engine of forced labor for the German war economy. Other SS officers, such as Martin Sommer, known as the Hangman of Buchenwald, became notorious for sadistic torture. Sommer was said to invent new methods of punishment, including burying prisoners alive or setting dogs upon them for sport. Gustav Sorg, another guard, earned the nickname Iron Gustav for his brutality in beatings and executions. These men reveled in cruelty, their names whispered in fear among prisoners. Together, they personified the camp's machinery of oppression, turning ideology into daily terror. Each figure became part of Buchenwald's legacy of sadism. Their crimes underscored the banality and brutality of evil. The corruption of the SS at Buchenwald extended beyond sadism into the black market economy that thrived within the camp. Guards stole food, clothing, and valuables from prisoners, selling them in nearby Weimar or smuggling them home to families. SS officers enriched themselves with gold teeth pulled from corpses, jewelry confiscated at intake, and valuables seized from murdered prisoners. Corruption reached such extremes that Himmler himself, usually indifferent to cruelty, ordered investigations. The trials of Koch and other officers were less about prisoner suffering and more about safeguarding the integrity of the SS. Still, they revealed the hypocrisy of a regime that punished theft while systematizing mass murder. Even within a structure built on atrocity, greed was seen as a betrayal of loyalty to the Reich. Prisoners, meanwhile, endured starvation while their guards feasted on stolen supplies. Corruption was not incidental, it was systemic, feeding both personal ambition and institutional decay. In Buchenwald, cruelty and greed were inseparable. The SS consumed both lives and possessions with equal hunger. The post-war trials exposed these notorious figures to the world, transforming them into symbols of Nazi corruption and cruelty. Survivors testified at length, recounting the sadism of Ilse Koch, the brutality of Sommer, and the greed of Karl Koch. Photographs of Ilse in court, haughty, defiant, sometimes smirking, cemented her as an icon of female complicity in atrocity. Newspapers around the world sensationalized her crimes, focusing on the lurid details of lampshades and sadistic punishments. While the myths sometimes obscured the facts, they ensured that Buchenwald's horrors were burned into public memory. Karl Koch's trial and execution by the SS revealed the internal contradictions of the Nazi regime. Sommer, Sorge, and Pfister also faced justice, though many escaped punishment or lived quietly after the war. The trials demonstrated that while some perpetrators were held accountable, others melted back into society. Justice was incomplete, but the names of Buchenwald's most notorious remained infamous. Their exposure turned personal cruelty into historical lesson. Infamy became their legacy, far more enduring than their power. The stories of Ilse Koch, Karl Koch, and their accomplices reveal the fusion of ideology, cruelty, and corruption that defined Buchenwald. They were not extraordinary monsters, but products of a system that rewarded brutality and encouraged greed. Their crimes were amplified by personal sadism, but they thrived in an environment that legitimized atrocity. Ilse's legend of lampshades, whether myth or fact, became a symbol of Nazi dehumanization at its most grotesque. Karl's embezzlement showed how even the SS could not tolerate theft from the Reich, though it tolerated mass murder. The Guard's corruption demonstrated that atrocity and profit went hand in hand. Together, these figures embodied the rot at the heart of Buchenwald. Their trials exposed not only individual guilt, but systemic failure. The camp's most notorious names became shorthand for cruelty institutionalized. In their shadows, the suffering of tens of thousands is remembered. Buchenwald's history is inseparable from their infamy. Though Buchenwald was never officially designated as a family camp, children found themselves within its barbed wire, swept up in deportations that targeted Jews, Roma, and political opponents alike. These children arrived frightened, disoriented, and far too young to understand the vast machinery of death surrounding them. Many were separated from parents upon arrival, clinging to strangers or siblings in the chaos of registration. Unlike Auschwitz, where most children were murdered immediately, Buchenwald held them primarily for forced labor or as incidental prisoners. This distinction offered a slim chance of survival, though their prospects remained grim. Starvation, disease, and brutality stalked them daily, thinning their ranks with merciless regularity. To the SS, children were expendable, burdens to be exploited or eliminated when convenient. Yet within the prisoner community, children represented something sacred, the fragile spark of the future. Protecting them became both an act of humanity and a quiet form of resistance. Amid horror, the presence of children revealed both the depth of cruelty and the resilience of solidarity. The heart of child survival in Buchenwald was Block 66, a barrack deliberately concealed within the little camp, farthest from the gaze of SS guards. There, political prisoners organized to shelter hundreds of boys, most of them Jewish orphans deported from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The International Prisoners Committee, led by German communists and other political detainees, placed sympathetic prisoner functionaries in charge of the block. These men carefully altered records, erased names from transport lists, and reassigned children to Block 66 under false identities. This act of defiance saved many from certain deportation to Auschwitz, where death awaited. The block became a fragile sanctuary where boys were given protection from the harshest labor details. Though still exposed to hunger, disease, and fear, they avoided the most immediate threats of execution or back-breaking work. Block 66 was not a place of comfort, but it was a shield. To live there was to inhabit a secret carved from defiance. In a camp designed for annihilation, it represented hope preserved. Life inside Block 66 was shaped by both deprivation and extraordinary care. Older prisoners, often teachers, writers, or intellectuals, sought to provide the children with structure amid chaos. They organized clandestine lessons, teaching reading, math, and history in hushed tones, using scraps of paper and charcoal stubs as makeshift tools. Songs, poems, and even whispered stories of life before the war offered a fragile connection to childhood. The block became a place where imagination, though suppressed, flickered in defiance of death. Food was scarce, but older inmates shared their rations, smuggling extra crusts of bread to keep the boys alive. When possible, comrades outside the block found blankets, clothing, or medicines for the youngest. Discipline was strict, for silence and secrecy were essential to survival. Any noise risked exposure. Still, the boys formed bonds of brotherhood, comforting one another in a world without parents. Block 66 was not only a barrack, it was a community forged in desperation and hope. The risks of protecting children in Buchenwald were immense, and those who sheltered them knew discovery meant brutal reprisal. The SS demanded constant roll calls, scrutinizing lists with suspicion, and any discrepancy could expose the hidden sanctuary. Prisoner clerks working in the camp office were crucial, forging documents and manipulating records to mask the presence of boys too young for labor. Doctors within the prisoner resistance faked illnesses or marked children as unfit for transport to keep them from being sent east. Each deception required courage and precision, for one mistake could doom them all. Guards occasionally entered the block, but sympathetic capos diverted attention, distracting them from noticing the small size of many inmates. Survivors later testified that without this elaborate system of protection, most of them would have perished. The preservation of Block 66 was a triumph of organization against annihilation. It showed that resistance could take the form of preservation, not only confrontation. To save a child was to defy the Nazi project itself. Among the children of Buchenwald were boys who would later become powerful witnesses to history. Elie Wiesel, the future Nobel laureate, was just a teenager when he arrived in 1945, emaciated and broken from Auschwitz. He was placed in Block 66, where the prisoner underground ensured his survival until liberation. Another boy, Yehuda Bacon, would later become a noted artist, his drawings testifying to the horrors he had seen. Countless others, unnamed and unrecorded, owed their lives to the shelter of Block 66 and the courage of prisoner protectors. Their survival stories are remarkable not only because they endured, but because they became voices of memory in later decades. For them, survival was not a private victory, but a duty to testify for the silenced. The presence of these future witnesses underscores the importance of Block 66's fragile sanctuary. In saving children, prisoners preserved the voices that would one day tell the world of Buchenwald. Without them, memory itself would have been diminished. Daily survival for the children was still grueling. Even within Block 66's relative safety, hunger gnawed constantly, and many were stunted by malnutrition, their bodies frail and vulnerable to disease. Coughs and fevers spread quickly in the overcrowded barracks, claiming lives despite the efforts of prisoner doctors. Emotional wounds ran deeper still, as boys wrestled with the trauma of separation, loss, and fear. Many had watched parents murdered or vanished during deportations, carrying scars that no shelter could erase. Yet they clung to life, sustained by the vigilance of older prisoners and the solidarity of peers. Small gestures, a shared crust, a whispered story, a smuggled pencil, became lifelines of hope. In the darkest hours, it was these fragile threads of humanity that kept them alive. Survival was never guaranteed, but it was fought for daily. For the children, life in Buchenwald was a test of endurance, softened only by the courage of others. The liberation of Buchenwald in April 1945 revealed the extraordinary survival of more than 900 children and adolescents, a number almost unimaginable given the conditions. When American troops entered the camp, they were stunned to find boys among the liberated, their hollow eyes staring from gaunt faces. These children had been preserved, not by chance, but by deliberate organized resistance within the camp. Photographs of young survivors, many clutching one another for support, became iconic images of liberation. They stood as proof that even amid horror, solidarity could save the most vulnerable. The boys of Block 66 embodied the triumph of humanity over cruelty, preserved not by the mercy of guards, but by the courage of fellow prisoners. Liberation brought freedom, but it also thrust them into a world scarred by trauma and loss. Many had no families to return to, their futures uncertain, yet their survival alone was a victory against annihilation. The children of Buchenwald became symbols of memory itself. The story of children in Buchenwald demonstrates both the depths of Nazi cruelty and the heights of prisoner resistance. In a system designed to erase the weak, political prisoners chose instead to protect them, risking their own survival for the sake of the young. Block 66 became a testament to the power of solidarity, a place where education, care, and hope endured against impossible odds. The boys who survived carried their memories into the post-war world, where they became witnesses, writers, artists, and educators. Their voices ensured that the story of Buchenwald would never be forgotten, especially its youngest victims and survivors. The survival of these children was no accident, but a deliberate act of defiance by men who refused to abandon the future. In their protection, the International Prisoners Committee revealed the deepest meaning of resistance. To save life, to preserve dignity, was the greatest rebellion of all. In the ashes of atrocity, children became the bearers of light. Their survival remains Buchenwald's most extraordinary legacy. Buchenwald, though not designed primarily as an extermination camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka, was deeply enmeshed in the machinery of Nazi mass murder. From its earliest days, transports departed regularly from the camp, carrying prisoners toward their deaths in the east. Jews in particular were targeted for these deportations, torn from Buchenwald's overcrowded barracks and forced onto trains bound for Auschwitz-Birkenau. Transports also carried Roma and Sinti families, as well as political prisoners deemed incorrigible. The selections for deportation were arbitrary and terrifying, often conducted during roll call or in the camp infirmary. Prisoner clerks and underground networks fought desperately to manipulate records, sometimes hiding children or vulnerable inmates from the lists. Still, the SS maintained the upper hand, and countless names were added to deportation orders with chilling efficiency. The victims had little warning, often marched directly from barracks to waiting trains. For many, Buchenwald was not the end, but the prelude to extermination. The camp became both a destination of suffering and a departure point for annihilation. The process of deportation was a ritual of terror, designed to strip prisoners of hope and identity. Selected inmates were assembled in the Appellplatz, surrounded by armed guards and barking dogs. They were forced into columns and marched under SS shouts, watched by fellow prisoners who knew that those departing would never return. The trains themselves were cattle cars, overcrowded with no food, little water, and almost no ventilation. Prisoners suffocated, froze, or starved before ever reaching their destination, turning transports into mobile coffins. Survivors of such journeys recalled the stench, the cries of the dying, and the silence of those who gave up. For those left behind in Buchenwald, deportations were both a relief and a torment, relief at being spared, torment at watching comrades vanish. The camp's underground resistance sometimes succeeded in removing names or smuggling prisoners out of transport lines, but their efforts could never match the sheer scale of deportations. The transports symbolized the reach of Nazi power beyond the camp's fences. They bound Buchenwald directly to the Holocaust's killing centers. Auschwitz was the most frequent and feared destination for those deported from Buchenwald. Starting in 1942, thousands of Jews were sent eastward, where nearly all were gassed upon arrival. Families were torn apart, with children, women, and the elderly condemned almost immediately, while stronger men were forced into labor before their inevitable deaths. The deportations linked Buchenwald to Auschwitz in a chain of death that spanned Nazi-occupied Europe. The SS often deceived prisoners, claiming they were being resettled or sent to easier labor camps. Hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished as news of Auschwitz spread among survivors. By 1943 and 1944, the truth was widely known, and the mere mention of deportation filled prisoners with despair. For the SS, deportation served as both a tool of extermination and a means of relieving overcrowding in Buchenwald. The camp thus functioned as a way station on the road to genocide. Its trains carried countless souls into the abyss. The tracks from Weimar became conduits of death. While deportations claimed tens of thousands, death within Buchenwald itself was a constant presence. Starvation slowly hollowed men until they collapsed during roll calls, their bodies dragged away under the indifferent eyes of guards. Disease cut swaths through the barracks, with typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery killing thousands each year. Brutal punishments, from hangings to beatings, further thinned the camp's population. The crematorium's chimney smoked day and night, its fire fueled by the endless procession of corpses. Prisoners described the sickening stench of burning flesh that drifted across the camp, an ever-present reminder of mortality. Bodies were stacked in heaps before being incinerated, their numbers so vast that cremation could not keep pace. During outbreaks of disease, mass graves swallowed hundreds at once. The very landscape of Buchenwald became infused with death, its soil mixed with the ashes of those consumed by the regime. Survival meant living side by side with death as an unrelenting neighbor. To breathe in Buchenwald was to inhale mortality itself. Executions were another pillar of death within the camp, carried out with ritualized cruelty meant to instill terror. Prisoners accused of escape attempts, sabotage, or minor infractions were hanged in the roll call square before the assembled inmates. The SS forced others to watch, ensuring that the lesson of fear was imprinted on all. Gallows and whipping posts became grim landmarks within Buchenwald, instruments of both punishment and spectacle. In some cases, SS doctors administered lethal injections to the sick, disguising murder as medical care. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, and Soviet POWs were especially targeted, executed en masse in the camp's infamous horse stable cellar. The underground resistance worked tirelessly to prevent discovery, but those caught in its ranks often met their end at the hands of SS executioners. The executions reinforced the message that no life was safe within the barbed wire. Death came not only from hunger or disease, but from the calculated cruelty of the guards. At Buchenwald, mortality was weaponized. The camp became a stage for death as performance. The statistics of death at Buchenwald are staggering and reveal the camp's lethal efficiency. Of the more than 250,000 men, women, and children who passed through its gates, at least 56,000 perished. These figures include approximately 11,000 Jews, alongside political prisoners, Roma, Sinti, and prisoners of war. The death toll was not a byproduct of war, but the deliberate outcome of Nazi policy, which combined starvation, labor exploitation, executions, and deportations into a unified system of annihilation. Each number represents a life extinguished, yet the statistics cannot capture the individuality of the loss. Behind the figures are stories of fathers, mothers, children, workers, and scholars, each swallowed by the machinery of oppression. The scale of death turned Buchenwald into a graveyard without markers, a place where identity dissolved into ash. Survivors testified that every corner of the camp bore silent witness to death. The figures haunt history not only for their magnitude, but for the humanity they conceal. Buchenwald's numbers remain its most chilling epitaph. The psychological impact of deportations and constant death was immense, shaping the daily lives of survivors. Each roll call brought dread, as prisoners feared hearing their names called for transport or execution. The sight of departing trains haunted those who remained, filling them with guilt for surviving while others vanished. Death within the barracks left men sleeping beside corpses, a grotesque normalcy that eroded the boundaries between life and loss. Hope became fragile, often extinguished by the endless cycle of suffering. Yet even amid despair, prisoners clung to acts of defiance, smuggling medicine, hiding children, or reciting prayers for the dead. These small gestures pushed back against the totality of death, preserving fragments of dignity. For survivors, memory itself became a form of resistance, ensuring that the countless victims were not forgotten. In Buchenwald, living meant bearing the weight of absence. Survival was as much about enduring death as it was about escaping it. Buchenwald's history of deportations and death stands as a testament to the breadth of Nazi cruelty and the resilience of those who endured. The trains that left its gates connected the camp to Auschwitz, Dachau, and other centers of destruction, spreading its victims across the geography of genocide. The crematoria and mass graves anchored death within the camp itself, ensuring that even those who were not deported often perished inside its fences. Survivors later recalled the omnipresence of death as both terror and motivation, driving them to fight for life in a world designed to erase them. The death toll, staggering in numbers, cannot capture the depth of suffering or the courage of survival. The deportations revealed the camp's role not only as a place of labor, but as a cog in the extermination machine. Its story is one of annihilation intertwined with defiance, of despair countered by resistance. In the end, Buchenwald was both a graveyard and a battlefield of the human spirit. The chapter of deportations and death remained central to its legacy. From the earliest days of Buchenwald, resistance germinated in whispers, gestures, and the smallest acts of defiance. Political prisoners, many of them communists, socialists, and trade unionists, recognized that survival demanded not only endurance, but organization. These men had experience in underground struggle, having resisted fascism in their home countries before capture. They brought with them skills in secrecy, communication, and discipline, laying the foundation for a clandestine network. Over time, this underground coalesced into a highly organized body known as the International Prisoners Committee. Its mission was twofold: to preserve life wherever possible and to prepare for the day when liberation might come. The committee infiltrated the prisoner functionary system, placing sympathizers in positions as block elders, clerks, and kapos. Through these positions, they gained access to records, rationing, and work assignments, all crucial levers of influence. Control of paperwork meant lives could be spared, deportations delayed, and children hidden. Resistance began in survival, but survival itself was already an act of rebellion. The smuggling of weapons was a daring escalation of this resistance, achieved through ingenuity and immense risk. Prisoners assigned to work in factories or workshops found ways to hide tools and small pieces of metal, slowly crafting crude knives or hammers. Contacts with outside civilians, including sympathetic laborers and even a few bribed guards, enabled the smuggling of more sophisticated items like pistols and ammunition. Weapons were dismantled and hidden in food containers, toolboxes, or false bottom crates, then reassembled inside the camp. Underground cells distributed these arms carefully, ensuring that no single discovery could unravel the network. The resistance also scavenged weapons from fallen guards or secretly stole them from storage areas, Every acquisition carried mortal danger, for discovery meant torture and execution. Yet prisoners persisted, stockpiling an arsenal small but significant enough to matter in the camp's final days. Smuggling weapons symbolized more than preparation. It embodied the determination to fight back against annihilation. Even in chains, they planned for combat. Organization was meticulous, for chaos meant certain failure. Resistance cells operated in strict secrecy, divided by nationality, but coordinated through the International Prisoners Committee. Germans, Poles, French, Czechs, Soviets, and others worked together, despite ideological and linguistic differences, united by the urgency of survival. Coded language and hand signals allowed communication across barracks and work details. Messages were written on scraps of paper, then burned after reading, leaving no trace for the SS. Meetings took place in latrines or workshops, where guards were less likely to intrude. Leadership rotated to avoid detection, and only trusted men were initiated into sensitive plans. Each unit knew only fragments of the larger strategy, ensuring the network could survive partial exposure. This discipline mirrored military precision, remarkable for men weakened by hunger and brutality. In Buchenwald, the underground created order where the SS imposed chaos. Organization became a weapon sharper than any blade. Sabotage of production was another form of rebellion, carried out silently but effectively. Prisoners working in armaments factories deliberately slowed output, filing machine parts incorrectly, or weakening materials so that weapons would fail in battle. Tiny adjustments, a misplaced screw, a misaligned gear, a mismeasured chemical, transformed tools of death into useless scrap. These acts required skill and subtlety, for discovery brought immediate execution. Yet the resistance persisted, measuring their success in ruined rifles, defective shells, and faulty machinery. They sabotaged not only German weapons, but the very rhythm of Nazi exploitation. Some prisoners risked their lives to smuggle out intelligence about production and troop movements, passing information to Allied networks through secret channels. Sabotage represented the prisoners' refusal to be passive cogs in the Nazi war machine. It turned forced labor into a battlefield, where defiance hid in every defective weapon. To weaken the Reich from within was to reclaim agency, even in captivity. Their hands, though chained, struck blows against tyranny. By late 1944, as Allied armies closed in on Germany, the resistance intensified its preparations for an open uprising. The International Prisoners Committee secretly trained men in military tactics, drawing on the experience of veterans of the Spanish Civil War and Soviet officers captured on the front. Wooden sticks served as rifles for drills, while whispered lectures in barracks explained formations, signaling, and strategy. Maps of the camp were memorized, with escape routes and armories identified in detail. Children were hidden more carefully, and weaker prisoners were sheltered from forced labor to conserve strength. Smuggled weapons were carefully distributed, hidden beneath floorboards and in false walls. The committee's vision was not only to fight, but to seize control of the camp at the moment of collapse. They knew liberation was approaching, and their task was to ensure prisoners were not massacred in the chaos of retreat. Resistance became preparation for history itself. Their goal was nothing less than to outlast the Reich's death grip. The atmosphere in the camp grew increasingly tense in early 1945. As the front lines neared and the SS became more desperate, deportations and death marches escalated, threatening to empty the camp before Allied troops arrived. The resistance recognized that delay could mean annihilation, pushing them toward decisive action. Secret meetings debated timing, weighing the risk of premature revolt against the certainty of destruction if they waited too long. The committee coordinated signals, planning to strike when the SS weakened under pressure from advancing armies. Morale among prisoners was a delicate balance of fear and determination. Some argued that survival alone was enough, while others insisted on armed defiance. In the end, unity prevailed, as leaders emphasized that resistance was not only about survival, but about dignity. They refused to die silently. The uprising became not just strategy, but destiny. April 1945 brought the moment of truth as American forces advanced through Thuringia and panic spread among the SS. Guards began abandoning posts, while orders for evacuations threatened to send thousands on death marches. The resistance acted swiftly, launching their uprising before catastrophe could strike. Armed with smuggled pistols, rifles, and improvised weapons, prisoners overwhelmed remaining guards in coordinated attacks. Watchtowers were seized, gates secured, and barracks defended in a surge of collective defiance. The camp's underground, nurtured for years, erupted into open rebellion, fulfilling its long-prepared plan. For the first time, the prisoners held power within Buchenwald, controlling their destiny. The uprising did not erase years of suffering, but it denied the SS their final act of destruction. In the final hours before liberation, Buchenwald became a camp of rebels, not victims. The uprising was their ultimate act of resistance. The Buchenwald uprising stands as one of the most significant acts of organized resistance within the Nazi camp system. It was not spontaneous chaos, but the culmination of years of planning, discipline, and solidarity. Prisoners who had once been strangers across nations and ideologies united in defiance, proving that even in the depths of terror, cooperation could triumph. Their success saved countless lives as death marches were halted and massacres prevented. The sight of armed prisoners seizing control of watchtowers marked a reversal of power unthinkable only months before. When American troops entered the camp on April 11, 1945, they found not helpless captives but survivors who had liberated themselves. This act echoed far beyond Buchenwald, inspiring post-war memory as a symbol of human courage. The uprising was a declaration that even in the shadow of death, dignity could be reclaimed. Resistance became survival, and survival became victory. In Buchenwald, defiance wrote its final chapter. By early 1945, as Allied armies advanced from both east and west, the Nazi regime faced the collapse of its vast network of camps. At Buchenwald, the SS confronted the reality that liberation was imminent, and their response was brutal: the forced evacuation of tens of thousands of prisoners. Orders from Berlin demanded that no inmate fall alive into Allied hands, both to conceal evidence of atrocities and to prevent liberated prisoners from joining resistance movements. As a result, the SS began organizing mass evacuations disguised as transports, but in reality, these were death marches. Prisoners, already weakened by starvation and disease, were forced to march for miles under armed guard, with almost no food or water. Those who faltered were shot where they fell, their bodies left along the roadside. The marches were not about relocation, but extermination through exhaustion and cruelty. To be chosen for evacuation was to be given a death sentence in slow motion. Buchenwald's death marches were among the most horrific episodes of its history. The process began with selections, as SS officers called prisoners to the roll call square under the guise of transfers. Thousands were pulled from barracks, assembled into columns, and driven out of the camp's gates at gunpoint. Prisoners often did not know where they were being taken, though rumors of Dachau and Flossenburg spread quickly. The columns stretched for miles, lines of emaciated men staggering across snow, mud, and ice. Each step drained their already depleted strength, and every mile became a battlefield against hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Guards showed no mercy, firing into the ranks at the slightest sign of weakness. Survivors recalled the sound of gunshots echoing across the countryside as men collapsed in the ditches. Locals along the routes witnessed these processions of death, though few dared to intervene. The marches transformed Germany's countryside into open-air graveyards. For those forced to walk, the ordeal blurred into an endless nightmare. Conditions on the marches were deliberately calculated to maximize suffering and mortality. Prisoners received almost no provisions, sometimes a crust of bread for several days' journey, leaving them to scavenge grass or snow for sustenance. Water was rarely allowed, and men drank from muddy puddles when guards turned their eyes. The winter cold cut through their ragged uniforms, turning frostbite into another weapon of death. Sleep was impossible. Prisoners marched by day and huddled together in barns or open fields by night, if they were permitted to stop at all. Disease spread quickly, as dysentery and typhus weakened men too frail to endure further. Corpses lined the routes, stripped of clothing by survivors desperate for warmth. The marches became moving camps of death, where survival was measured in minutes rather than days. The SS exploited every weakness, killing swiftly to instill terror. These were not evacuations in the conventional sense. They were executions stretched across the landscape of a collapsing Reich. The psychological torment of the marches was as devastating as the physical suffering. Prisoners who had endured years inside Buchenwald now faced the final cruelty of dying within sight of liberation. The constant gunfire, the sight of comrades collapsing, and the knowledge that every step might be the last eroded hope. Some men gave up entirely, lying down in the snow to await the bullet they knew would come. Others clung desperately to survival, driven by thoughts of family, faith, or vengeance. The columns were eerily silent, punctuated only by groans and the commands of SS guards. Survivors later described the marches as journeys through a living graveyard, where each man became both mourner and condemned. The sense of abandonment was profound, as locals who saw them often turned away, unwilling to help. For many, the death march was the ultimate symbol of Nazi cruelty, destruction pursued to the very end. Even as the Reich collapsed, it clung to murder as its final act. The death marches from Buchenwald spread across vast distances, leaving trails of death through Thuringia, Bavaria, and beyond. Some columns headed south toward Dachau, others east toward Flossenburg, while still more wandered aimlessly, their destinations unclear even to the guards. The routes covered hundreds of miles, with prisoners trudging through villages, forests, and fields under the eyes of civilians. The marches often intersected with advancing Allied units, forcing guards to alter paths in chaotic detours. This confusion only increased the suffering, as prisoners walked in circles or were marched for days without purpose. Survivors recalled seeing the same villages more than once, realizing that the SS had no clear plan. The randomness of their ordeal deepened the sense of despair, as the prisoners were trapped in an endless, purposeless march. The geography of Germany itself became a weapon, swallowing lives into its forests and fields. The marches transformed the countryside into extensions of the camp system. Everywhere the columns went, death followed. Acts of resistance and solidarity emerged even in these marches of death. Prisoners shared scraps of bread, carried the weak, and whispered words of encouragement to keep spirits alive. Some attempted escapes, breaking away into forests under the cover of night, though many were recaptured or killed. Local civilians occasionally risked their lives to throw food or water to the columns, defying the watchful SS. Resistance networks, including partisans and Allied contacts, sometimes sheltered escapees, offering a glimmer of hope amid despair. Within the marches, solidarity was both a moral necessity and a survival strategy. Stronger prisoners shielded children or frail comrades, refusing to let them fall behind. The SS tried to pit men against one another, but cooperation endured even in extremity. These moments of courage shone like faint lights in the darkness of the death marches. Survival, though unlikely, was sometimes wrestled from the jaws of certain death. Resistance was not erased, even on the road to annihilation. The death toll from Buchenwald's evacuations was staggering, adding thousands more to the camp's already horrific record. Exact numbers remain difficult to calculate, for many perished anonymously on the roadside, their bodies buried hastily or left for scavengers. Estimates suggest that of the 28,000 prisoners evacuated in April 1945 alone, more than half never reached their supposed destinations. These deaths were not random but deliberate, the culmination of Nazi ideology's obsession with destruction. The SS leadership had no intention of allowing prisoners to survive as witnesses. The marches thus became a final extension of the Holocaust, genocide carried into the open fields of a collapsing Germany. Survivors recalled the eerie sight of Allied troops finding corpses along roadsides before reaching the camps themselves. Liberation came too late for thousands who had endured years behind barbed wire, only to die on the threshold of freedom. The marches epitomized the futility and cruelty of the final Nazi days. They were massacres stretched across time and distance. The death marches from Buchenwald remain among the most haunting legacies of the camp, encapsulating both the depths of Nazi cruelty and the resilience of those who endured. They revealed a regime so consumed by hatred that it chose destruction even in defeat, sacrificing human lives in pointless cruelty. Yet they also revealed the capacity for solidarity, courage, and survival amid unimaginable suffering. The scattered survivors carried their stories into the post-war world, ensuring that the marches would not be forgotten. Their testimonies described not only the brutality, but the humanity preserved in fleeting acts of compassion. For them, survival was both miracle and burden, haunted by the memory of those left behind on the roadside. The marches turned Germany's landscape into a witness, every village and forest marked by the passage of death. They symbolized the Reich's final descent into madness and murder. In the story of Buchenwald, the death marches form the most tragic final chapter before liberation. They are remembered as the road of shadows that led from captivity to freedom, but at a terrible cost. In the first days of April 1945, as American forces advanced deep into Thuringia, the SS at Buchenwald realized their grip was slipping. Panic spread among guards, many of whom fled their posts in the face of the Allied onslaught. Orders from Berlin had called for the complete evacuation of the camp, a final act of destruction that would have condemned thousands more to death marches. But the scale of the prisoner population, nearly 21,000 men, women, and children still inside, made such an evacuation impossible. The International Prisoners Committee, long preparing for this moment, saw an opportunity. The underground network mobilized its hidden arsenal of smuggled weapons and sharpened tools, ready to seize control at the right time. Every prisoner knew that a misstep could bring massacre, but the alternative was certain annihilation. The camp was a powder keg, its fate balanced on the edge of desperation and defiance. Liberation was no longer a dream, but an approaching reality. The question was whether they would live to see it. On April 11th, 1945, the tension finally erupted into open revolt. As the SS abandoned watchtowers and American artillery thundered in the distance, the prisoner underground gave the signal, armed with pistols, rifles, knives, and makeshift clubs. Prisoners stormed the remaining guards. Watchtowers were overrun, and prisoners hoisted weapons seized from fleeing SS men. Barracks emptied as thousands of captives surged forward in a coordinated wave of rebellion. The uprising had been meticulously planned, and now in the chaos of collapse, it succeeded with stunning speed. Within hours, the prisoners had secured the inner camp, disarmed guards, and hoisted their own sentries in the towers. For the first time, the barbed wire encircled not victims but survivors who had claimed power. Liberation in part had come from within. The men of Buchenwald had freed themselves before their liberators arrived. That afternoon, units of the U.S. 6th Armored Division, part of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, approached the camp gates. Soldiers, weary from battle, were unprepared for what awaited them inside Buchenwald. Expecting a prison or military installation, they instead encountered a scene of unimaginable horror. Survivors, skeletal and hollow-eyed, crowded the fences, waving makeshift banners that read, "Anti-fascists greet the liberators." The Americans entered cautiously, weapons at the ready, but quickly realized they were witnessing a human catastrophe beyond comprehension. Piles of corpses lay unburied near the crematorium, the stench of death hanging in the air. Survivors, some too weak to stand, crawled toward the soldiers in disbelief and relief. For the liberators, the shock was overwhelming, their war-hardened nerves unprepared for the sheer scale of suffering. Liberation was both triumph and trauma. It was the moment when freedom collided with the evidence of atrocity. The Americans documented everything they found, knowing the world would need proof of the crimes committed at Buchenwald. Photographers and journalists followed close behind, capturing images that seared themselves into the conscience of history. Rows of emaciated survivors, some children, stared blankly at cameras, their bodies testaments to years of starvation. The crematorium still smoked, its ovens filled with ash and bone fragments. Prisoner records, uniforms and medical files lay scattered in SS offices, offering damning evidence of the camp's operation. Officers ordered local residents from nearby Weimar to tour the camp, forcing them to confront the horrors that had unfolded just beyond their town. Many claimed ignorance, but their shocked faces revealed the undeniable reality. For the survivors, being seen was as important as being freed. At last their suffering was acknowledged. Liberation turned them from invisible victims into witnesses. The evidence of Buchenwald became undeniable, permanent, and eternal. The emotions of liberation defied simple description, mixing relief with grief, joy with sorrow. Survivors wept, laughed, and collapsed in the arms of their liberators, unable to process the moment fully. Some shouted defiantly, raising clenched fists as symbols of victory over oppression. Others remained silent, stunned into stillness after years of suffering. Children emerged from Block 66, their small frames a shocking contrast to the machinery of death that had surrounded them. For the prisoners who had organized the uprising, the moment carried particular meaning. They had not only survived but reclaimed their dignity by resisting until the very end. Yet liberation also underscored the enormity of loss, for countless comrades had perished in the final weeks. Freedom was tempered by the weight of absence, by the knowledge that survival came at immense cost. For many, the moment of liberation was not a release, but the beginning of a new struggle. They had to learn how to live again. The Americans were unprepared for the humanitarian crisis that liberation created. Tens of thousands of survivors required immediate care, their bodies weakened to the brink of collapse. Field hospitals were hastily established, but food and medicine were scarce. Some survivors, desperate and starving, ate too quickly and succumbed to refeeding sickness, dying just as freedom arrived. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, but the sheer scale of need was overwhelming. Military authorities struggled to maintain order, as survivors searched for lost family members and sought revenge against captured guards. Chaos mixed with relief, producing an atmosphere unlike any other battlefield. Liberation was not a clean moment of triumph, but a messy, painful process of survival. For many soldiers, Buchenwald left scars deeper than combat. The camp revealed not only the cruelty of the enemy, but the fragility of human life itself. Amid the chaos, the International Prisoners Committee asserted itself, ensuring that liberation did not descend into disorder. The underground leaders organized survivors, maintained barracks discipline, and worked alongside American officers to distribute food and aid. They raised red flags over the camp, symbols of their anti-fascist resistance and their international solidarity. For them, liberation was both a military victory and a political triumph, proof that their years of clandestine struggle had not been in vain. Survivors later recalled this moment as one of profound unity, when men of different nations and beliefs stood together in freedom. The committee's leadership ensured that the chaos of liberation became a moment of order and dignity. It also preserved the memory of resistance, embedding it into the camp's legacy. Liberation was not simply given, it was claimed. The prisoners of Buchenwald had shaped their own destiny in the final hour. Their uprising made freedom their victory, not just their rescue. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, stands as one of the most powerful moments of World War II, a convergence of survival, resistance, and revelation. It exposed the depths of Nazi atrocity while also demonstrating the resilience of those who endured. The uprising by prisoners, combined with the arrival of American forces, created a unique liberation narrative. Not only were the captives freed, but they freed themselves. The sight of skeletal survivors greeting U.S. soldiers with banners of defiance symbolized the triumph of humanity over barbarism. Yet liberation was not an ending but a beginning, as survivors faced the monumental task of rebuilding shattered lives. For the Americans, it was an encounter that changed their understanding of the war, turning abstract reports of atrocities into undeniable reality. The world, through photographs and testimony, would never be able to look away. Liberation made Buchenwald not just a camp, but a symbol of survival and remembrance. It remains one of history's clearest testaments to the endurance of the human spirit. In the weeks after Buchenwald's liberation, the camp became not only a site of memory, but also a courtroom of conscience. The US Army quickly gathered evidence, photographing every corner of the camp, cataloging medical records, and preserving the testimonies of survivors. These records were vital for holding perpetrators accountable, for already whispers of denial and disbelief were surfacing beyond the barbed wire. The American authorities realized that justice must be swift but thorough to demonstrate to the world the scale of Nazi crimes. Former SS officers, guards, and functionaries captured on site were interrogated, often confronted with the very victims they had tormented. Survivors pointed out sadistic guards, identifying them before Allied investigators. The evidence piled up, painting a picture of systemic brutality rather than isolated abuses. Buchenwald became a proving ground for post-war justice, a test of how humanity would respond to industrialized atrocity. The stage was set for one of the earliest war crimes trials of the post-war era. Justice was not only demanded, it was inevitable. The most notorious trial began in April 1947 in Dachau, where 31 former SS members and functionaries of Buchenwald were placed before a US military tribunal. Known as the Buchenwald Trial, it was one of a series of proceedings designed to prosecute crimes committed in concentration camps. The charges included murder, torture, starvation, and participation in the operation of a system designed for enslavement and death. Among the defendants were Commandant Hermann Pister, medical staff implicated in deadly experiments, and notorious guards infamous among survivors. The proceedings revealed not only acts of cruelty, but also the administrative efficiency that allowed mass suffering to continue. Witness after witness, emaciated but determined, testified to the horrors of roll calls, medical experiments, and executions. Photographs and films taken by liberators were shown to the court, confronting the defendants with undeniable evidence. The defense often claimed obedience to orders, but the tribunal dismissed such excuses. The trial demonstrated that obedience did not absolve responsibility in crimes against humanity. The verdicts would set precedents for justice worldwide. The trial concluded with harsh but uneven sentences. 22 of the accused were found guilty, with 11 sentenced to death by hanging. Others received lengthy prison terms, though a handful were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. The executions were carried out in June 1948 at Landsberg prison, a grim echo of the justice meted out for crimes beyond comprehension. Hermann Pister, the camp's final commandant, was sentenced to death but died of illness before his execution. Some perpetrators escaped altogether, having fled before capture or assumed false identities in the chaos of post-war Germany. Survivors felt relief at seeing justice done, but frustration lingered that many guilty individuals evaded responsibility. The unevenness of the outcomes reflected the limits of the tribunal system, constrained by evidence politics and shifting priorities in the early Cold War. Still, the trial signaled a new era in international law, where mass murder could no longer be hidden behind uniforms and orders. Buchenwald had become not only a camp of suffering, but a courtroom of history. No figure from Buchenwald loomed larger in public imagination than Ilse Koch, the so-called Witch of Buchenwald, the wife of the camp's first commandant, Karl Otto Koch. Ilse became infamous for her cruelty, her sadistic whims, and her alleged collection of artifacts made from human skin. Survivors recounted her habit of riding on horseback through the camp, whipping prisoners for amusement. Stories spread of her ordering tattoos cut from corpses, later bound into lampshades or ornaments. Though some of these claims were exaggerated or never fully proven, they crystallized her as a symbol of female participation in Nazi sadism. Tried by a U.S. military tribunal in 1947, Ilse was sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet, in a controversial move, her sentence was later reduced to 4 years, sparking outrage among survivors and the public. A subsequent trial by West German courts reinstated her life sentence, and she remained imprisoned until her suicide in 1967. Ilse Koch became a grim legend, embodying both the cruelty of the camp and the complexities of post-war justice. Her name remains synonymous with the monstrous face of Buchenwald. Other figures met swifter justice. Karl Otto Koch himself, notorious for corruption and brutality, never lived to face Allied trial. Accused of embezzlement and murders unrelated to his duties at Buchenwald, he was tried by the SS in a rare internal proceeding. Found guilty of corruption and abuse of power, Koch was executed by his own organization in 1945, before the Americans arrived. Gustav Sorge, nicknamed the Iron Gustav for his harshness during roll calls, was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Martin Sommer, the hangman of Buchenwald, infamous for his sadistic tortures, also faced post-war prosecution. Many of these men were hunted relentlessly by Allied authorities and survivor networks, though not all were captured. The patchwork nature of justice reflected both determination and limitation. Some perpetrators became symbols of accountability, while others melted into anonymity. The trials offered a measure of justice, but never matched the magnitude of the crimes. Survivors carried both vindication and bitterness into the post-war years. The Buchenwald trials also revealed the role of medical personnel in atrocities, laying groundwork for the later Nuremberg doctors' trial. Physicians who had conducted typhus experiments or deliberately infected prisoners with deadly diseases faced testimony from survivors and colleagues. These proceedings exposed how medicine had been weaponized, transforming doctors into agents of torture and death. Testimonies recounted needles plunged into arms without explanation, men collapsing from induced illnesses, and corpses dissected for research. The horror lay not only in the experiments, but in the betrayal of medical ethics. For the world, these revelations underscored that atrocities were not confined to guards with guns, but extended to professionals who cloaked murder in the guise of science. Several doctors were sentenced to death or imprisonment, though some escaped accountability. The inclusion of medical crimes in war crimes trials set a global precedent, establishing that following orders could not excuse violations of human dignity. Buchenwald's doctors became part of the world's collective condemnation of Nazi science. Their legacy was not discovery, but disgrace. Justice, however, was fragmented and often incomplete. Many perpetrators slipped away during the war's chaotic end, blending into the civilian population or fleeing abroad. Some were shielded by Cold War politics, as both East and West Germany selectively pursued prosecutions to suit their ideological narratives. In East Germany, Buchenwald became a symbol of anti-fascist resistance, but trials often emphasized political messages over comprehensive accountability. In the West, shifting priorities toward rebuilding Germany led to leniency and early releases for some convicted Nazis. Survivors frequently expressed frustration, watching their tormentors live out comfortable lives while they themselves carried lifelong scars. The gap between the scale of crimes and the scale of justice haunted post-war Europe. Still, the existence of the trials mattered. They established records, named names, and prevented complete erasure. Even when sentences seemed inadequate, the world had acknowledged the crimes. Justice was imperfect, but silence would have been intolerable. The trials became an incomplete but vital reckoning. The aftermath of Buchenwald's liberation demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of justice after mass atrocity. The trials established precedents in international law, affirming that crimes against humanity could not be hidden behind the excuse of obedience or wartime chaos. Yet they also exposed the challenges of pursuing accountability on a scale so vast that no court could match the suffering endured. Figures like Ilse Koch became infamous symbols, while countless lesser perpetrators faded into obscurity. For survivors, the trials were necessary but never sufficient, a beginning rather than a conclusion. Justice delivered punishments, but it could not restore families, erase trauma, or balance the ledger of loss. The camp's legacy thus lived on, not only in legal records, but in memory, testimony, and education. Buchenwald's trials stood as warnings to future generations about the consequences of unchecked cruelty. They were both a victory for humanity and a reminder of its limitations. The pursuit of justice, however flawed, ensured that the crimes of Buchenwald would never vanish into silence. After the guns of war fell silent, Buchenwald did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it became one of the central symbols of Holocaust remembrance. Its proximity to Weimar, once a cultural capital of Germany, gave its story particular resonance. A camp of horror built beside a city of Goethe and Schiller, survivors carried their testimonies into courtrooms, classrooms, and books, ensuring that Buchenwald's name would remain etched in human memory. The camp's liberation had been heavily documented by US forces, leaving an indelible photographic and cinematic record. These images traveled the world, confronting audiences with the stark evidence of Nazi crimes. In the post-war years, Buchenwald was preserved not just as ruins but as a museum of conscience, Walking through its gates became a ritual of memory, a confrontation with history's darkest chapter. From its barracks to its crematorium, the camp evolved into a living classroom. Buchenwald was no longer only a place of death. It became a shrine to remembrance, warning, and survival. The memorialization of Buchenwald was deeply shaped by Cold War politics, as the camp lay in Soviet-occupied East Germany after 1945. The East German state turned Buchenwald into a cornerstone of its official anti-fascist narrative, emphasizing the role of communist resistance over the suffering of Jewish prisoners. In 1958, the German Democratic Republic unveiled the Buchenwald Memorial, a massive complex featuring sculptures, towers, and inscriptions honoring resistance fighters. While this narrative elevated anti-fascist heroism, it downplayed the broader scope of Nazi atrocities, particularly the genocide of Jews. Survivors often felt this selective memory silenced parts of their story. Yet the site still served as a space of mourning and remembrance, visited by millions of schoolchildren and citizens each year. The memorial, with its somber design, conveyed both triumph and tragedy. Visitors confronted the reality that human cruelty could thrive within sight of cultural brilliance. Buchenwald became a paradox, a symbol shaped as much by ideology as by memory. Still, it carried the weight of history forward into new generations. In West Germany, remembrance of Buchenwald followed a different path, emerging slowly from silence and denial. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Federal Republic struggled with how to confront its Nazi past, and sites like Buchenwald were often marginalized in public discourse. Survivors' testimonies played a vital role in breaking this silence, as memoirs and documentaries exposed the camp's atrocities. The global trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 renewed attention on the Holocaust, and Buchenwald re-entered public consciousness as part of this broader reckoning. Western historians and educators emphasized the universality of Buchenwald's story, not only as a Jewish tragedy, but as a human one, encompassing political prisoners, resistance fighters, and countless others. Survivor voices, particularly those of children like Ella Wiesel, became central to shaping how Buchenwald was remembered. Their testimonies provided both intimate detail and moral authority. In this way, Buchenwald's memory crossed ideological divides, linking East and West through the shared demand to remember. Silence gave way to acknowledgement, and acknowledgement to education. The site of Buchenwald itself became a physical archive of remembrance, where ruins bore silent testimony to the crimes committed there. The crematorium still stands, its ovens preserved as stark reminders of the machinery of death. Visitors walk through reconstructed barracks, exhibition halls, and memorial plaques that tell the stories of prisoners from every background. Excavations unearthed personal artifacts, shoes, glasses, letters, each a fragment of individual lives erased by the Nazis. These objects gave the past a human face, connecting the enormity of statistics to personal tragedy. Guided tours and exhibitions contextualized the camp within the broader machinery of the Holocaust and Nazi forced labor. Survivor organizations played a critical role in shaping the narratives presented, ensuring accuracy and dignity. Today, the Buchenwald Memorial includes not only physical relics, but digital archives, preserving testimonies for future generations. The camp's landscape has been transformed into an open book of memory. Every building, every scar in the earth whispers the story of survival and loss. Survivor testimonies remain the heart of Buchenwald's legacy, carrying its history from the camp into the conscience of the world. Figures like Elie Wiesel, who was liberated at Buchenwald as a teenager, devoted their lives to telling the story of what they witnessed. Wiesel's writings, speeches, and Nobel Prize acceptance address made Buchenwald a touchstone in the moral reckoning with the Holocaust. Other survivors, such as Leo Eitinger and Eugen Kogon, also contributed to the collective memory, publishing memoirs and studies that revealed the psychological, political, and social dimensions of camp life. These voices gave texture and humanity to what might otherwise have remained abstract horror. Testimonies were recorded in schools, museums, and documentaries, becoming an irreplaceable archive of living memory. Each survivor carried both trauma and responsibility, turning their pain into a weapon against forgetting. Without them, Buchenwald's ruins would have been mute stones. With them, it became a story alive in the human voice. Memory was preserved not only in monuments, but in language, warning, and testimony. Buchenwald's legacy extends beyond Germany, becoming a universal lesson about the dangers of hatred, ideology, and dehumanization. Its history is taught in classrooms worldwide, often as a central case study in Holocaust education. The camp symbolizes not only Nazi cruelty, but also the resilience of those who resisted and survived. Teachers use Buchenwald to explain the mechanics of dictatorship, the fragility of democracy, and the responsibility of individuals to resist oppression. The memory of the camp challenges complacency, urging vigilance against racism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism in all forms. Museums and memorials across the globe reference Buchenwald alongside Auschwitz and Dachau as pillars of remembrance. Survivors and educators emphasize that its lessons are not bound to the past, but resonate in the present. Every visit, every book, every testimony reinforces the message, never again. Buchenwald's story has become a compass for moral responsibility. It warns humanity not only of what happened, but of what could happen again. In recent decades, renewed scholarship and archaeological research at Buchenwald have deepened understanding of the camp's complexity. Excavations uncovered previously unknown mass graves, hidden structures, and artifacts that expanded the historical record. Historians have re-examined the roles of guards, collaborators, and industries tied to Buchenwald, tracing the web of complicity beyond the camp's fences. Survivor testimonies have been digitized, allowing future generations to hear their voices directly, even after they pass. Virtual reconstructions and interactive exhibits now immerse visitors in the history of the camp, ensuring engagement with younger audiences. Yet these advances also highlight a sobering truth: as survivors die, memory must shift from personal witness to historical responsibility. The preservation of Buchenwald is not merely about stones and ruins, but about a living commitment to education. The challenge of the future is to keep remembrance meaningful without living survivors. The camp's legacy depends on how humanity chooses to carry it forward. Memory is a duty, not a choice. The memory of Buchenwald closes with both mourning and hope. It mourns the 56,000 who perished there, the countless more deported to their deaths, and the immeasurable suffering endured behind its barbed wire. Yet it also celebrates the courage of those who resisted, the resilience of those who survived, and the commitment of those who remembered. Buchenwald's legacy is not frozen in stone, but alive in testimony, education, and vigilance. It reminds us that cruelty can flourish anywhere, even in the shadow of culture and civilization. But it also teaches that resistance is possible, that solidarity can endure, and that humanity can reclaim dignity even from despair. Every generation that visits the camp inherits its message, carrying forward both warning and hope. In the silence of its ruins, voices still echo of suffering, of survival, of remembrance. Buchenwald endures not only as a place, but as a lesson. Its legacy is humanity's responsibility. Its memory is humanity's conscience.